If you're picturing a medieval castle as a snug fireside retreat where lords sipped mulled wine while harpists strummed lullabies, let's reset that thermostat. Picture instead a colossal stone refrigerator with slightly better artwork and far more rodents. Medieval castles were not built for comfort. They were built to keep invaders out, arrows in, and heat apparently on permanent vacation. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, how medieval people slept in castles without turning into popsicles, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Northern and Western Europe, prime castle territory, wasn't exactly balmy. Long winters, damp autumns, and winds that could strip paint off anything if paint had been invented for that purpose meant the mercury, or whatever they used to guess temperatures, often hovered somewhere between brisk and your nose is falling off. Summer could be pleasant, but a good chunk of the year offered temperatures that whispered, hibernate, human, hibernate. Now add construction choices that would make any modern contractor weep. Those imposing grey walls, often 2 to 3 meters thick, weren't insulation champions. Stone is superb at two things: withstanding siege engines and conducting cold straight into your marrow. When you hug a castle wall in January, you're basically embracing the concept of hypothermia. Builders didn't include fiberglass, double glazing, or cozy loft insulation. Their blueprint was pile stones high enough to terrify the neighbors and maybe add a flag. Windows. Think arrow slits with pretensions. Narrow, tall gaps designed more for shooting crossbow bolts than letting in golden rays of morning warmth. Glass was a rare luxury, and where it existed, it was wavy, brittle, and about as insulating as a polite apology. Drafts poured through cracks, whipping tapestries like annoyed spirits, and whistling lullabies nobody asked for. Floors didn't help much either. Stone flags on the lower levels acted like chilled dinner plates beneath your toes. Upstairs, wooden floors retained marginally more heat but groaned ominously underfoot, broadcasting each midnight snack run to the entire household. Rugs and rush mats softened the aesthetic but did little against the creeping chill seeping upward like a determined ghost of last winter. The climate wasn't uniform. Southern France's castles shivered less than those in Scotland or northern Germany, but the architectural DNA was the same. Defense first, comfort somewhere around 12th priority. Medieval lords cared less about whether their feet felt like popsicles, and more about whether those feet stayed attached after a siege. It's hard to enjoy a roaring fireplace if the enemy just catapulted a cow through your window. And those vast interiors? Romantic as they look today, they're heat sinks disguised as banquet halls. High ceilings encouraged rising warm air to form a private cloud 9 feet above your head, leaving the humans below wondering if their breath should count as a weather forecast. An echo could rattle around long enough to develop its own personality, which is charming until you realize echoes don't hold blankets. Medieval chroniclers occasionally mention a biting cold within even the grandest chambers, proof that nobility wasn't immune to shivering. A French poet in the 14th century grumbled about his drafty lodging, noting the wind played the lute upon my bones. That's poetic, for I'm freezing and every rib is now percussion. So why didn't castle designers fix it? Priorities. Fortifications were statements of power and survival. Comfort was an afterthought. Castles rose during eras of frequent warfare. Their worth was measured in how long they could withstand a siege, not in guest satisfaction ratings. A toasty room means little if the enemy's already dancing in your courtyard. Still, life went on. Banquets happened, marriages were celebrated, and people somehow slept. Imagine nightly routines with torches sputtering, the distant hoot of an owl, and the unmistakable awareness that a mere door of planks separated you from both the frigid night and a bored guard humming off-key. Cozy, only if you redefine cozy as less life-threatening than sleeping outside. Think of a castle's comfort level this way. Airbnb advert copy might read, rustic charm, authentic medieval vibes, convenient murder holes, BYO firewood. 5-star review would sound like. Didn't die, loved the view, fingers still thawing. The good news? You were unlikely to be surprised by an invading army at 2 a.m. The bad news? The cold was a loyal companion, always present, never paying rent. Yet, amid this granite gloom, people adapted. They didn't simply curl up and resign themselves to frostbite. Over generations, castle dwellers invented an arsenal of tactics, layered bedding, strategic hearths, and occasionally sheer stubbornness to turn those stone caverns into something approaching survivable. But that's for later chapters. For now, accept that when you step across a medieval threshold, you've traded modern central heating for an architectural statement roughly equivalent to sleeping inside a quarry. So tighten your cloak, blow on your fingers, and marvel at humanity's ability to pretend that a glorified fortress can double as a bedroom. Welcome to the stone icebox. Your medieval staycation starts here, and the thermostat is permanently set to chilled discomfort. If you've ever flipped through glossy brochures of luxury castle stays, you may have been lulled into believing medieval bedrooms were proto-5-star suites. Truth check. The original floor plan was less romantic getaway and more defensible cave with optional bed. When fortification dictated the architecture, privacy and comfort often got politely shoved off the drawbridge. In most castles, the concept of a private bedroom was an earned privilege. The lord and lady typically claimed a sole or a semi-private upper-floor chamber, name-dropping the sun, though it rarely lived up to the marketing. That space doubled as an office, a dressing room, and the place where heirs were quietly conceived while distant cousins hammered on the door asking about unpaid debts. Below the solar, reality hit the help. Servants, squires and guards often slept shoulder to shoulder in the great hall, or tucked into alcoves beneath staircases. Nighttime was less me time and more us time, complete with orchestral snoring, guard gossip, and the occasional dog stealing your blanket. A castle at rest was still a community, dozens, sometimes hundreds of souls finding floor space wherever a body would fit. Guests might rate better or worse depending on status. A minor noble could snag a curtained-off corner or a truckle bed dragged close to the hearth. Lesser visitors sometimes unrolled bedding on rushes, effectively camping indoors with bonus drafts. Comfort ranked below politics. Seating at dinner and the assignment of sleeping space both measured how important you truly were. Sleep location was social hierarchy spelled out in goose feathers and floor splinters. Even when you scored a real room, it wasn't the cozy nook of modern imagination. Bedrooms in keeps were lofty, almost theatrical. High vaulting made even moderate chambers feel cavernous, as though the architecture's primary goal was to intimidate your pajamas. Timber beams arched overhead like rib cages, reminding you that you were sleeping inside an organism built to digest sieges, not pamper guests. Ceilings soared for practical reasons. Heat rises, smoke from torches and hearths needed an escape route, but the aesthetic side effect was that your bed felt like an undersized raft adrift on a stony ocean. Voices bounced off walls in stereo, so a whisper of "Did you hear that?" could boomerang into "Did you hear that?" Cue panic at 2 a.m. Windows, when present, resembled vertical letterboxes. Slim apertures meant to repel arrows rather than invite sunshine. The effect by day was perpetual twilight. By night, the gloom made every hanging cloak resemble a lurking assassin. Curtains weren't decorative frills, but strategic drafts, blockers and privacy screens. Though even the heaviest fabric struggled against winter winds pushing through mortar gaps. Arrow slits offered distant glimpses of moonlight, but amplified wind like an uninvited flautist. Early glazing, if you could afford it, warped views so severely your neighbor's sheep looked like drunken ghosts. More common were wooden shutters, practical at blocking both breeze and burglar, but about as airtight as polite conversation at a tax audit. A word on flooring. Bedrooms in principal keeps commonly rested on stout timber planks laid over crossbeams. Beneath lurked either another chamber or the abyss of a chilly lower hall. Heat retention wasn't their strength. Planks leaked drafts like gossip at court. Thick rushes or woven mats helped a little. Think nature's carpet, plus whatever insects rode along for free. Stone floors, common in lesser chambers or tower annexes, turned bare feet into popsicles by dawn. A simple trip to fetch water might feel like traversing an Arctic skating rink. Slippers and wooden clogs existed for a reason, an attempt to stave off frostbite while avoiding the scorn of your toes. Do not imagine fluffy pillows embroidered with inspirational quotes. Wall treatments, if you had them, meant tapestries showing saints, battles, or suspiciously heroic ancestors. They served dual duty, moral uplift, and half-hearted insulation. Paint was rare, plaster occasionally smeared on, but the dominant aesthetic was unapologetically rocky. Forget mood lighting. Torches dripped wax and smoked like guilty conspirators. Atmosphere in a medieval bedroom was the literal scent of burning tallow. Furniture beyond the bed, sparse. A chest, perhaps, doubling as wardrobe and occasionally emergency seat. A stool for your boots. A pegged rack for the inevitable sword. Minimalism wasn't a design choice. It was survival math. Less clutter when you might need to sprint because someone's battering the portcullis at dawn. Spatial politics ruled the night. The higher your chamber in the keep, the more secure and marginally warmer you were. Elevation signaled privilege, since attackers had to scale extra stairs and warmth floated your way by sheer physics. Nobles literally rose above their household, ensconced behind doors heavy enough to outlast a determined cousin with inheritance ambitions. For the majority below stairs, communal slumber carried social flavor. Guard rotations meant someone always stirred. Boots clacked, dogs barked. Privacy. That modern sacred cow was nowhere in sight. What you lost in solitude, you gained in rumor. Few secrets survived a dozen light sleepers sharing a bench. Standing inside a medieval chamber stripped of museum labels, you quickly sense its dual nature, at once intimate and martial. Bedposts might be carved with vines and heraldry, yet arrow loops glare down like suspicious uncles. A lord's master suite felt less like a sanctuary and more like the VIP section of a military bunker. Exclusive, prestigious, and about as snug as a courthouse waiting room. Interior decor, mostly 50 shades of grey because granite doesn't do pastels. Medieval chic wasn't about soothing earth tones, it was about survival tones. The guiding principle: if we can keep marauders out, a little frostbite is an acceptable trade. So, while storybooks promise roaring fires and embroidered coverlets, remember, the castle bedroom was an engineering compromise. Luxury peeked in, battle readiness slammed the door. Tonight's sleep came courtesy of thick walls, dubious drafts, and an unspoken hope that no one below decided the Great Hall was due for a loot session at midnight. When the sun ducked behind the battlements and a frost-laden wind began composing sonnets through the arrow loops, every soul inside the castle faced the nightly puzzle: how to keep a human body at a non-icicle setting. In an age before thermostats, or even the concept of indoor climate control, fire was less a cozy accent and more the line between pleasant dreams and why do my toes sound crunchy. The crackling hearth wasn't just romantic, sometimes it was your entire heating strategy. Early keeps relied on open central hearths, essentially legal campfires plunked in the middle of a room. Flames licked upward, smoke wandered wherever whimsy dictated, and occupants coughed politely while pretending not to weep tears of regret. By the 12th and 13th centuries, masons introduced fireplaces with stone hoods and rudimentary chimneys, a revelation roughly on par with discovering bread slices go together. Now at least some smoke could be funneled outward rather than marinating the household like an artisanal ham. Not every room scored this marvel. Chimneys were expensive feats of engineering, demanding vertical stonework and constant upkeep. The Lord's chamber, a solar or a prized guest suite, might boast a carved mantel, but many spaces limped along with braziers, portable metal pans holding charcoal or embers. Braziers glowed valiantly, radiating just enough warmth to remind you what comfort might feel like in theory. Keeping fires alive required an unending fuel pipeline. Woodland rites were jealously guarded, Peasants' forays into noble forests for just a bundle could earn fines or worse. Logs had to be seasoned, chopped, hauled and stored under cover lest damp timber hiss like a disapproving aunt. A castle's winter readiness was often measured in stacked cords. Running out meant awkward dinner parties where everyone wore 3 cloaks indoors. Charcoal, popular for braziers, burned cleaner but demanded production pits, skilled colliers and patient tending. Importing it over distance was costly, so many households struck a compromise. Big rooms earned wood-fueled blazes, minor chambers made do with glowing charcoal baskets, and the servants layered clothing until they resembled ambulatory haystacks. Medieval ventilation was more guesswork than science. Chimneys drew poorly on still nights, smoke sulked and billowed, and ceilings collected soot stalactites of questionable charm. Residents joked or wheezed that they could track family lineage by lung capacity. Yet smoke also performed unintended favors. It discouraged insects, dried beams, and lent ceilings a fashionable charcoal chic. Guests might complain of watery eyes, but castle folk treated mild asphyxiation as an occupational hazard. After all, where there's smoke, there's at least partial warmth, and fewer mosquitoes willing to test your patience. Enter the tapestry, unsung hero of thermal psychology. Far more than medieval wall posters, these woolen giants trapped air, cut drafts, and dressed otherwise forbidding stone in narrative flair. Scenes of hunts, saints, and improbable unicorns doubled as bragging rights. Look at my imported dye budget, while sparing residents from feeling like they slept inside a quarry. Well-heeled lords commissioned vast sets to wrap chambers in a woolen cocoon. Even smaller households mimicked the idea with woven hangings or animal pelts. Function met fashion. A cold wall hidden beneath a galloping stag became slightly less cold and considerably more conversation-worthy. Romanticized illustrations omit the persistent hazard of stray sparks. Medieval bedding was flammable enthusiasm disguised as linen. Braziers overturned, torches sputtered, and smouldering logs leapt onto rush mats like delinquent squirrels. Entire castles occasionally learned the hard way that stone walls protect poorly against ceilings lined with timber. Consequently, many households kept water buckets or sand nearby, while servants patrolled for errant embers after bedtime. Fire was salvation and threat. Your warming ally by dusk, your insurance nightmare by dawn. Wood smoke laced with oak, ash, or beech lent chambers an earthy perfume. Modern marketers would dub authentic medieval hearth number 7. Charcoal produced suppler notes, preferable in bedrooms where occupants valued breathing over branding. Herbs sometimes smoldered on embers, lavender, rosemary, or juniper, to mask odors and freshen stale air, inadvertently doubling as medieval aromatherapy. A well-stoked hearth magnetized company. Storytelling, card games, and harp recitals orbited the glow. Heat's gravitational pull flattened social hierarchies for a spell. Steward, minstrel, and lady's maid all drifted near the embers, strategizing subtle elbow nudges for prime seating. In a culture where winter darkness outlasted patience, the fireplace became both heating core and community anchor, flames flickering against stone-cast dancing shadows that soothed or spooked, depending on the evening's gossip. Couples whispered vows, scribes copied parchments, and sentries thawed fingers while war stories lengthened with each retelling. Firelight didn't merely push back cold, it reframed reality, convincing weary minds that the fortress could be homelike, at least for tonight. In the absence of thermostats, the medieval castle leaned hard on burning things, layering walls with cloth, and telling itself the smoke was character. Fire was paradox, indispensable, fickle, occasionally homicidal. Yet without it, a castle was a tomb of ice. With it, the stone giant softened just enough to lull you into uneasy slumber. Tomorrow the embers might betray you with smouldering mischief, but tonight warmth wins by a nose. If the fire didn't quite chase away the chill, and the stone walls continued impersonating glaciers, The only defense left was a good old-fashioned textile avalanche. Medieval sleepers learned quickly that the surest way to avoid frostbitten ears was to transform themselves into an edible metaphor. Sleep strategy. Become a human lasagna, layer yourself until you can't roll over. It was less about elegance and more about sheer survival by suffocation under warmth. The base layer began with a humble mattress, rarely the plump, cloud-like affair furniture ads promised today. For most castle residents, the mattress was a palliace, essentially a sturdy sack stuffed with straw or rushes. It crackled every time you shifted, and occasionally harbored bonus wildlife, fleas, beetles, the occasional adventurous mouse, turning bedtime into an entomological lottery. Yet straw held heat, provided cushioning against wooden planks, and was at least affordable enough to refresh when it rotted or smelled like last year's stable. Nobles, unwilling to be serenaded by rustling stalks, commissioned feather mattresses that attempted to imitate floating on a sleepy goose cloud. The feathers compressed and needed regular fluffing, but the tactile luxury made them a prized status symbol, a soft rebellion against stone austerity. On top of this base went layers of fabric determined by rank and purse. Wool dominated because sheep are nature's answer to "I hate freezing." Heavy woven blankets retained heat, wicked away damp, and could be folded into double or triple thickness when January decided to test human resolve. Linen sheets, smoother against the skin, formed an intermediary barrier, theoretically cleaner though laundering them involved heroic scrubbing and plenty of sun. If you were truly fortunate or fabulously wealthy, an underblanket of down feathers appeared, an insulating marshmallow that made the concept of tucking in feel like disappearing into a snowdrift of comfort. Above these came more serious contenders, fur covers made from fox, hare, or even bear, depending on which relative owed you tribute or which hunt had recently gone awry. To modern eyes, draping yourself in animal pelts may look like the set of a low-budget fantasy epic, but in a world with no thermostat, fur equaled survival. Each pelt captured layers of air, transforming the sleeper into a vaguely regal yet immobile burrito. Servants sometimes stitched pelts together into sprawling coverlets so weighty you required a squire to excavate you come morning. The hierarchy of warmth played out with comic intensity. Lords added counterpanes embroidered in bright dyes, partly to signal wealth, partly because look at my imported scarlet, distracted guests from noticing the draught that whistled like a drunken minstrel. Children often bunked 2 or 3 to a bed, stealing warmth by sheer proximity. Servants scavenged whatever cloth scraps were spare, doubling cloaks or spare tunics into makeshift quilts. In winter, blankets migrated like nomads, reassigned nightly to whoever threatened to turn blue first. Hospitality meant lending not only bedding but survival odds. An overlooked hero of the bedtime arsenal was the humble bolster, a long pillow stuffed tight enough to block creeping drafts at bed edges. Bolsters lined the perimeter like sleepy sentinels, keeping toes from pressing against frigid boards and creating a tiny air pocket of slightly tolerable climate. Some beds featured additional mattresses stacked vertically, the medieval origin of the princess and the pea trope, though reality leaned less whimsical. Multiple palliasses simply meant more straw buffering you from whatever cold abyss lurked beneath. Layering wasn't purely textile, positioning mattered, sleeping diagonally to catch maximum blanket spread, hugging a fur while wedging your knees into the warmest straw hollows, and strategically folding cloth into ridges, all became personal arts. Castle nights sometimes sounded like rustling symphonies, as residents adjusted covers, retucked corners, and muttered prayers that mice found a different corridor to audition in. Despite the arsenal, warmth was rarely perfect. Heavy blankets could pin you so tightly your dreams included faint memories of burial. Night sweats followed by sudden cold patches taught a perpetual lesson in thermodynamics. Yet compared to the alternative, waking up with joints frozen like morning icicles, submission to the weight was a fair bargain. Nobles occasionally boasted of feather beds stacked high enough to require a stool for climbing in, bragging rights measured not by mattress softness but by sheer altitude. Visitors often wrote of their astonishment at the bed-making rituals. Chronicles describe chamberlains and maids layering cloth with the precision of military engineers, tucking corners, smoothing lumps, and beating straw to achieve temporary fluff. Winter preparation looked less like turn-down service and more like prepping a battlefield. A well-dressed bed signaled hospitality as surely as a laden banquet table. Skimp on either and your guest might return home singing unflattering ballads about your frugality. Comfort, in the medieval lexicon, was a relative term. The faint must of wool, the occasional flea, and the crushing embrace of a fur stack all registered as victories over frost. In a fortress where the walls rejected warmth, bedding became personal armor against the night. A silent defiance of physics whispered through every hastily sewn quilt. The nightly cocoon was proof that adaptation beats complaint. When the environment insists on glaciation, human ingenuity stitches, stuffs and stacks until dawn feels survivable. Imagine stepping into your bedroom, blowing out a candle, and not slipping into flannel pants or a soft cotton t-shirt, but instead wriggling into a linen shift, yanking on woolen stockings, tying a cap under your chin, and wondering if you're dressed to sleep or to appear in a particularly uncomfortable painting. That was bedtime in a castle. The medieval pajama drawer looked less like a Victoria's Secret catalogue and more like the lost and found at a monastery. A basic starting point for most sleepers was the linen or hemp shift, essentially a long, loose undershirt. It wasn't fashion-forward, but it breathed reasonably well, and more importantly, could be washed more often than your outer clothes. Remember, personal hygiene was intermittent. A clean layer next to the skin kept your dear wool tunic from acquiring its own postal code. Linen also wicked a little moisture and acted as a barrier between you and the slightly crunchy bedding stuffed with straw or feathers. Calling it silky smooth would get you laughed out of the hall, but at least it spared your elbows from the prickliest bits. Nobles, ever eager to demonstrate that they were richer and perhaps warmer than everyone else, might add layers, quilted coats called nightgowns, fur-lined wraps, or even lightweight robes. There's ample evidence that some gentry skipped the idea of dedicated nightwear altogether, and simply kept their day garments on, loosening a belt or two for comfort. The thinking was simple. Why peel off your costly attire when the air around you is approximately the temperature of a polite glacier? It also meant you were halfway dressed if a servant burst in yelling, "Sire, the West Tower's on fire," a genuine possibility given how often candles and wooden beams made frenemies. Extremities mattered. Wool socks or hose were nearly mandatory for anyone wanting to keep toes attached until morning. Wool has the charming property of insulating even when damp, which is crucial when your climate control system consists of a draft and a prayer. Some wealthier folk invested in fur-trimmed booties. Yes, castle slippers, because nothing says I'm serious about surviving the night like footwear in bed. If your feet weren't toasty, your whole body felt like it was auditioning for an ice sculpture contest. Now let's talk about the MVP of medieval night fashion, the cap. Illustrations from the period show everyone from kings to kitchen maids tying on snug linen or woolen caps before lying down. Why? Because your head leaks heat faster than the royal treasury during a tournament season. A good cap could mean the difference between slumber and frostbite-flavored insomnia. Some were simple skull caps. Others looked suspiciously like the ancestor of today's beanie. Children wore them, monks swore by them, and chroniclers occasionally mocked people who forgot theirs as shivering fools. It wasn't glamour, it was survival millinery. Hands weren't left out either. Wool gloves or mitts appeared in inventories and wills, suggesting that fingers deserved a fighting chance. Imagine clenching icy hands around your blanket at 2 a.m., longing for spring. People who could afford multiple pairs rotated them, much as you might swap out phone chargers. Peasants sometimes slept with hands tucked inside the shift, burrito style. Nobles added fur lining and ribbon ties, ensuring the glove wouldn't escape mid-dream and embark on a solo adventure to the rush-covered floor. Color: mostly natural shades, off-white linen, greyish wool, brown furs. Fashion plates didn't dictate winter 1360, mauve is in, because functionality trumped aesthetics. That said, the richest lords might flaunt dyed fabrics simply to remind the world that they could afford such extravagance. Crimson sleeping caps occasionally appeared, and if you were really trying to project swagger, you might own a fur-edged nightrobe cut from imported cloth. Nothing impresses your peers quite like napping in luxury while they huddle in last season's homespun. There's also the curious matter of belts and cords. Some garments were cinched at the waist, even at bedtime, which seems about as relaxing as snuggling in a corset. The reason? Layering stability. Without a tie, your many folds of wool and linen might twist into a Gordian knot by dawn. Better to keep the whole ensemble mildly restrained than wake up entangled like a poorly wrapped burrito. And yes, people sometimes slept fully dressed, not always, but enough that chroniclers mention it casually. Long journeys, military campaigns, or fear of sudden nighttime calamity encouraged knights and their squires to keep chain shirts nearby or even on. Sleeping in armor was rarely ideal, but at least your dreams weren't punctuated by the phrase surprise raid. The end result? A medieval sleeper looked less like someone cozying up for 8 blissful hours and more like a traveler caught between wardrobes. Yet every piece had a job: hold in heat, stave off frost, survive the night. When you see paintings of a lord lounging in velvet robes, remember, somewhere off canvas lies a wool cap, several socks and a resigned sigh. Picture the torchlit hallway of a great stone keep after midnight, a few sputtering candles, the faint smell of smoke, and behind one heavy oak door, a small crowd trying to pretend this is privacy. Medieval castles weren't built for introverts. If you were hoping for a serene monastic night alone, tough luck. The architectural plan leaned toward open hostel with battlements, and in winter, that crowd of bedfellows might be the only thing standing between you and a frosty obituary. Communal sleeping wasn't just for peasants packed into thatched cottages. It carried up the social ladder. Servants routinely unrolled straw pallets at the foot of their lord's bed, partly for warmth and partly for rapid deployment in case of emergencies. My lord, a messenger. Also, your left boot has vanished into the rushes. Guards sometimes dozed in adjacent chambers, weapons close enough to grab at the first whiff of trouble. Even visiting dignitaries could find themselves assigned to the same chamber as half a dozen others, separated by little more than a muttered "mind your elbows, sir." Practicality ruled. Castles were complicated fortresses, not boutique hotels. Space in the inner ward was limited, and each extra fireplace was a logistical nightmare of smoke, fuel, and maintenance. Instead of heating a dozen tiny rooms, you concentrated people and therefore heat into fewer spaces. A cluster of warm bodies raised the temperature a few precious degrees, which might mean comfort instead of chattering teeth. Your snoring cousin transformed from nuisance into organic central heating. Security played an equal role. A lord's household relied on eyes, ears, and swords at all hours. A bedroom wasn't just a place to rest, it was a command post in case of nighttime raids, accidental fires, or a disgruntled cook with a vendetta. By keeping trusted servants or armed retainers nearby, the lord reduced reaction time. A bellowed "wake" there over the wall was far more effective when half the room was already sitting up rubbing sleep from their eyes. Then there's the social dimension. Medieval life orbited around hierarchy and togetherness. Your household was family, staff, and defense force rolled into one. Sharing a chamber forged bonds, or at least enforced tolerance. The night became an informal council, a place where whispered alliances formed or gossip percolated while everyone pretended to be asleep. Modern offices talk about team-building exercises. Medieval lords had blanket diplomacy. Privacy, by our standards, didn't register the same way. Curtains around a bed gave the illusion of solitude, but a sneeze, cough, or ill-timed snore pierced that veil instantly. Nobles occasionally hung heavy drapes from wooden frames to create a room within a room, trapping both heat and a fragment of personal space. Yet the hum of breathing, the occasional shuffle of someone shifting on straw, or a muttered dream about tax rolls was an unavoidable soundtrack. If you didn't learn to sleep through it, you didn't sleep at all. Think of the upside. Snoring, while maddening, doubled as an early burglar alarm. Someone creeping across the floor would disrupt the nocturnal chorus. Stolen blankets? Merely an invitation to hone your negotiation skills. The faint glow of a single ember in the brazier and the murmur of distant guards on patrol created a lullaby uniquely medieval. Earplugs weren't an option, but after a few seasons of castle life your brain rewired itself. Creaks, coughs, and an occasional goat bleat. Yes, animals sometimes bedded down indoors, merged into a strangely comforting night music. For lower-ranking servants, sleeping en masse was survival. Dozens of people rolled up on rush mats in a hall radiated enough heat to keep frost from forming on their eyebrows. Children wedged between parents absorbed warmth like human hot water bottles. Unmarried men bunked with each other without ceremony, their laughter and grumbling carrying up to the rafters. Nobody asked top bunk or bottom, it was shift left, there's room near the fire. Visiting strangers sometimes complicated the picture. Chronicles recount awkward nights when an ambassador's retinue had to camp in the Lord's chamber because every other corner of the castle was already claimed. Diplomacy occasionally meant being polite while someone's squire mumbled in his sleep beside you. Etiquette manuals barely touched the subject beyond be courteous and keep your hands to yourself. And if you really couldn't abide a human blanket pile, tough. Single occupancy rooms were a rare privilege, mostly for the very top tier of nobility, and even then the illusion of solitude often shattered when servants tiptoed in at dawn with pitchers of water. Sleep was less a retreat and more a community project, everyone contributing body heat, security, and unavoidably occasional midnight conversations about why Roger the cook keeps kicking in his dreams. So yes, the castle at night resembled an oddly regimented sleepover, complete with rustling blankets and hushed gossip. Your roommate could be your lord, your cousin, or the guy sharpening swords by day and hogging sheets by night. The warmth of company was literal and figurative, part survival strategy, part social glue. Step into a chilly castle chamber, breath fogging in the air, and you'll understand why medieval sleepers treated fabric like a defensive weapon. Stone walls may impress during a banquet, but at 2 a.m. they radiate about as much warmth as an offended snowman. Enter the bed hanging, swaths of cloth engineered to turn a frigid mattress into something vaguely resembling a human habitat. It was the Middle Ages' answer to climate control, achieved not by technology, but by generous drapery and a fervent hope moths wouldn't stage a coup. Canopy beds, or 4-posters, were more than aristocratic bling. Those towering corner posts weren't decorative vanity. They supported a wooden or rope frame from which hung heavy curtains. Close the curtains, and you've essentially built a fabric tent within your bed. The payoff was immediate. Your own body heat, plus that of anyone sharing the mattress, warmed the air inside, while the cloth barricades slowed drafts sneaking across the floor. Every breath, every sigh, transformed into a minor victory over the cold. Think of it as an electric blanket, except powered by stubbornness and livestock proximity rather than an outlet. The curtains weren't wispy gossamer either. Wealthier lords commissioned dense wool, lined with fur or padded linen, stitched into panels that could rival a modest sail. Some tapestries even bore the family crest or delicate embroidery, ensuring your thermal fortress doubled as a brag wall. Common folk, lacking coin for elaborate canopies, improvised with whatever they owned. Blankets suspended from pegs, spare cloaks tacked to rafters, or even rough sacking stitched together until it behaved like a makeshift draft guard. Fashion statements were optional. Warmth was mandatory. Wall draperies amplified the effect. Bare masonry is a tyrant, sucking heat into its cold heart. But hang a rich tapestry or even a rough wool sheet, and you blunt the chill. Noble chambers often displayed heraldic scenes or hunting panoramas, not just to impress visitors but to save fingers from frostbite. A guest admiring a unicorn frolicking across a tapestry might not realize that unicorn was also an unpaid insulation specialist. Lower status households mimicked the trick on a humbler scale, hanging patchwork cloth or old cloaks. Drafty arrow slits could be blocked with anything pliable, sometimes even straw mats if fabric was scarce. Closing the curtains created a curious duality. Inside your bed bubble, the world felt snug, intimate and far smaller than the cavernous hall beyond. Outside, the castle might as well have been the Arctic. Inside, you built a tiny tropics powered by shared breath and sheer willpower. Two sleepers inside a well-draped bed could lift temperatures several degrees, enough to stave off shivers and produce the rarest medieval luxury, a reasonable night's sleep without chattering teeth. Privacy, though secondary to warmth, came as a bonus. A set of drawn curtains allowed whispered conversations, covert snack smuggling, or the illusion you weren't technically part of the snoring chorus across the chamber. Noble couples appreciated the semblance of seclusion even if three servants slept a few paces away, their rhythmic breathing punctuated by the occasional cough. Curtains blurred the lines between personal and public space, a small mercy in an environment where solitude was rarer than fresh citrus. Curtains had enemies: smoke, soot, and candle flames. One ill-placed ember could turn your microclimate into a spectacular yet regrettable bonfire. Accounts of accidental bed hangings igniting were frequent enough to spur cautionary tales. Households adopted rules: never leave a candle burning unattended, douse hearth fires before retiring. A smouldering wool curtain was less romantic than it sounded, and considerably more life-threatening. Yet people took the risk, because a night without curtains meant bracing yourself for the full might of a February draft crawling under your covers like a mischievous poltergeist. Materials varied. Wool dominated for its warmth and relative fire resistance. Linen appeared as lining or lighter summer layers. Richer nobles indulged in velvet or brocade, sometimes imported purely because they could. Fur edging added both insulation and a whiff of opulence. Marten, fox, or squirrel depending on your budget and the patience of your household hunters. Colors followed the familiar medieval palette: deep reds, greens, and blues that masked soot stains and impressed neighbors. A bed dressed in dull grey sackcloth may have been warm, but it didn't scream dynastic power. Even lower ranks mimicked the concept on a minimal scale. Servants strung up old cloaks or tattered blankets to form sleep pockets near the hearth. Children giggled under hanging quilts, playing castle tents centuries before camping gear existed. Drafts were democratic. Anyone with spare cloth wanted less of them. The psychological effect can't be overstated. Draped fabric created a sense of safety, a barrier between your vulnerable sleeping self and the vast, echoing dark. The Middle Ages teemed with anxieties: robbers, spirits, the odd disgruntled boor, so drawing curtains around your bed felt like claiming a private fortress. Some even embroidered charms or stitched symbols into seams, an extra defense against nightmares or whatever the priest warned about last sermon. When dawn broke, curtains opened to reveal the chill awaiting beyond. The cozy cocoon evaporated, replaced by reality, stone frost, and perhaps an impatient steward banging on the door. But for those brief hours wrapped in fabric walls, a sleeper carved out their own climate, warmed by ingenuity and stubborn defiance of winter. Long before thermostats and radiant floor heating, the castle itself had to pull its weight as a reluctant heater. Architects, if we can call the determined masons of the 12th century architects rather than people with a suspicious number of rocks, understood that a building designed solely for defense would double as a winter torture chamber, so they slipped in features that, while not exactly cozy, nudged the temperature from polar bear spa toward marginally survivable. The first weapon in their arsenal was sheer mass. Castle walls often measured several feet thick, a sandwich of rough stone, rubble, and lime mortar that would impress even the most jaded geologist. Those walls behaved like thermal batteries, brutally cold to touch in January, but slow to surrender whatever warmth seeped inside. During summer, they blocked heat, granting blessed coolness. In winter, they at least blunted the icy assault. Imagine living inside a stone thermos. The trick was simply not to expect miracles. Windows, more like strategic loopholes for archery. Medieval casements were tiny slits or modest rectangles, designed to minimize enemy arrows and intrusive weather. Glass was a luxury until later centuries. Many windows sported wooden shutters, parchment stretched on frames, or thin horn panels that let in light while discouraging drafts. Fewer and smaller windows meant fewer opportunities for cold wind to march in like it owned the place. The result was a paradoxical dimness. Yes, your reading corner resembled a cave, but at least your eyebrows didn't frost over while you squinted at illuminated manuscripts. Vertical planning also helped. Heat, that fickle creature, always rises, and castle designers leaned into the fact. Lower floors, closest to earth and stone, acted like natural refrigerators. Storage, pantries and cellars lurked down there because cheese doesn't mind the chill. The human population gravitated upward. Lords' chambers, council rooms and solar, from sol, meaning sun, occupied the higher stories, where residual heat from roaring fireplaces and general body activity wafted upward. Live upstairs became medieval shorthand for enjoy life above the frost line. It was less about status and more about survival, with the happy accident that nobles had better views and slightly warmer toes. Then came spiral staircases, those dizzying stone corkscrews beloved by defensive strategists. Their twisting ascent also created subtle thermal zones. Each landing offered a pocket where air could linger, and the spirals discouraged direct drafts from ripping through the building like a runaway banshee. Climbers gained cardio, defenders gained tactical advantage, and residents avoided having an Arctic windpipe in the heart of their home. Narrow corridors and low doorways further slowed airflow, trapping whatever warmth candles and bodies provided. Architectural coziness by accident, or at least by partial intent. Floor placement mattered beyond high versus low. Rooms clustered near the Great Hall, where fires blazed longest, naturally benefited. Chambers adjoining kitchens basked in bonus heat, though sometimes with an unwelcome garnish of roast mutton aroma. Conversely, remote towers functioned as iceboxes with scenic views, great for storing banners, terrible for housing your grandmother. Wealthy lords might retreat to the solar, a room specifically designed with bigger windows for sun and thicker walls for warmth. Not quite a sauna, but it beat shivering in a corner like a neglected squire. Timber floors, though creaky, helped insulate. Stone directly underfoot would chill a monk's soul. Wooden planks plus a rush mat made survival less teeth-chattery. Some castles added layers of reeds, straw, or even woolen mats as rudimentary carpeting. Mice may have appreciated the interior decorating, but humans appreciated not feeling like they were tiptoeing on a glacier. Roof design contributed its bit, steeply pitched to shuck rain and snow. Roofs often contained attics where heat could gather, albeit briefly before vanishing into the ether. Later castles sometimes incorporated rudimentary vents or louvers, balancing the eternal struggle between keep smoke in check and please don't let this chamber morph into a wind tunnel. Masons weren't drawing thermal blueprints, but they understood the relationship between open gaps and icy misery. Even stairwell placement was a quiet ally. Corridors bent sharply, forcing cold air to zigzag instead of bulldozing straight into bedrooms. Door thresholds were deliberately snug, minimizing that shocking midnight gust when someone forgot to latch the hall. In essence, the entire building was a fortress not just against marauders, but against frost, with defense strategies sometimes overlapping. Thick gates repel soldiers and winter simultaneously. Psychologically, living in a cleverly arranged castle meant small victories. Realizing your chamber on the third floor stayed marginally toastier than the guardroom downstairs, or smugly noting that your side of the keep caught more afternoon sun. People traded anecdotes like move your pallet closer to the south wall, the stones there hold heat till dawn. It wasn't a 5-star spa, but the structure worked with you, not entirely against you. So when a noble bragged, "My solar is delightfully temperate," he wasn't spouting idle vanity. The interplay of massive masonry, shrunken windows, twisting stairs and vertical logic made the difference between frost-bitten relic and functioning aristocrat. Clever architecture meant the castle wasn't only a war machine, but a tolerable home, aching every advantage from stone and wood. Bedtime in a castle was never just yawn, lights out. Before you could even think about surrendering to slumber, there was a small obstacle course of warm-up routines designed to convince your stubborn, frost-nibbled body that night would be survivable. Medieval folks, practical and occasionally reckless, discovered that the best way to get warm was to wage an all-out pre-sleep campaign involving kitchen, cellar, and a few mildly dangerous heating gadgets. The evening meal set the stage: heavy stews thick with barley, root vegetables, and whatever protein the cook had managed to source functioned as edible insulation. Calories, especially from meat and bread, were body fuel. Think of it as loading coal into the furnace before closing the boiler room. A well-fed peasant could face a draughty hall with a smug belly, while a hungry squire shivered despite 4 blankets. Fatty dishes were prized in winter, not merely for taste but for staying power. Your body would spend hours digesting, releasing a slow trickle of heat long after the candles guttered. Liquid courage followed. A nightcap wasn't metaphorical. Mugs of warmed ale, mulled wine laced with cinnamon or cloves, and even mead gently simmered near the hearth appeared in countless households. The philosophy was simple: heat the drink, drink the heat. Spices like ginger, nutmeg, and pepper, expensive though they were, carried a reputation for warming the blood. Whether they truly raised core temperature or merely convinced you of it, the psychological effect mattered. Imagine sipping a steaming, honey-sweet wine while outside the courtyard groans under snow. The illusion of coziness is half the battle. Not everyone had the luxury of imported spice, but even a humble tankard of ale, slightly warmed, could trick the senses. Some monasteries swore by posset, a comforting concoction of milk curdled with ale or wine and dosed with sugar or herbs, a sort of medieval bedtime latte with fewer baristas and more monks. Children sometimes received thin potages or watered-down cider, mild enough to be safe, warming enough to tame whining about cold toes. Then came the tools of thermal warfare. Bed warmers, a shallow metal pan on a long handle, were common in wealthier homes. Filled with embers, slid between sheets, and shuffled vigorously, they preheated a mattress faster than any pile of blankets could. Of course, enthusiasm carried risks. Glowing coals plus linen equals a very memorable night, sometimes ending in frantic bucket brigades. Cautionary household lore passed down grimly: never linger the pan lest the bed become your pyre. For the less affluent, simpler methods abounded. Smooth stones heated by the hearth, wrapped in cloth or tucked inside a wooden box, acted as primitive hot water bottles. Bricks performed the same trick: warm them, swaddle them, bury them beneath the blankets before retiring. Properly executed, this maneuver created a pocket of toasty delight, persuading reluctant feet that life was still worth living. Improperly executed, it scorched toes or singed bedding, prompting stern lectures about brick discipline. Hands and feet were special targets. Gloves or wool socks received a moment of basking near the hearth before bed, creating a fleeting but heavenly warmth that lingered just long enough to coax the body toward drowsiness. Children sometimes carried their heated stones like bedtime teddy bears, an oddly charming image if you ignore the constant parental reminder: don't drop it, or you'll set the rushes smoldering. Aromatics occasionally entered the ritual. Sachets of dried herbs, lavender, rosemary, thyme, were tucked beneath pillows, partly for scent, partly under the vague impression they repelled bad airs. Nobles with access to exotic imports might even sprinkle rosewater on linen for a dash of luxury. Did it make the room warmer? Absolutely not. Did it feel like you were sleeping in sophistication rather than a granite-lined freezer? Indisputably yes. The pre-sleep hour also doubled as a social checkpoint. After the evening meal, households often lingered around the hearth, sharing ale, mending gear, or telling tales. Laughter, songs, and gossip softened the psychological sting of the cold. A warm stomach plus camaraderie dulled the chill, and by the time candles were snuffed, the body and mind were at least convinced warmth was possible. Think of it as group therapy against hypothermia. Some rituals tilted towards superstition. A cup of spiced wine might be blessed with a quick sign of the cross, both for divine favor and, frankly, because no one wanted to wake up blue. Folk beliefs promised that whispering a charm over your drink or tapping the hearth thrice kept frost imps at bay. Science? No. Comfort? Absolutely. Timing mattered too. People rarely bolted from hearth to bed. A gradual wind down allowed internal fires to steady, hearth coals were raked to avoid sparks, shutters checked, animals bedded, and only then did the family troop upstairs or down hall. The transition, though mundane, reinforced security, nothing left undone to gnaw at the mind in the dark. By the time the final ember faded, a medieval sleeper lay beneath layers, belly pleasantly weighted by stew, blood humming with mulled wine, feet nudged against a hot brick, muttering only mildly about whether the blanket would ignite before dawn. These small, nightly victories turned an unforgiving castle into something faintly hospitable. If you've made it through the story of cold stone, creaking timbers and fire-hazard bed warmers, you might assume every medieval winter night ended with a frozen household huddled in misery. That picture, thanks to centuries of Gothic novels, moody films, and the occasional museum display of a lonely straw pallet, is only half the truth. Yes, castles were chilly. Yes, drafts whistled like ghosts rehearsing for an opera. But human beings, remarkably stubborn mammals that we are, refused to roll over and become historical popsicles. Adaptation wasn't optional. It was survival. Let's set the record straight. Medieval folk didn't stumble into every winter thinking, oops, we forgot heat again. They had centuries of practice turning architectural inconveniences into functional homes. Fireplaces, while smoky by modern standards, radiated genuine warmth. A banked hearth in a great hall could keep embers alive all night, ready for dawn rekindling. Layered bedding, wool clothing, and sheer habit trained bodies to tolerate what would make modern sleepers call an HVAC technician at 3 a.m. Resilience was baked into the daily rhythm. Complaining might warm your lungs, but only ingenuity warmed your toes. Contrast the reality for different social strata. The wealthy lord and lady enjoyed a stone chamber at least partly buffered by tapestries, with a canopy bed forming a cozy fort of curtains and pelts. Servants or guards stationed near the hearth often commandeered leftover heat, positioning themselves strategically like human solar panels. Down in the servants' quarters, or worse, the draft-ridden hall, a humble mattress of straw or rushes met the sleeper, but not without its tricks. Layered cloaks, warmed stones, and sleeping cheek by jowl with family, friends, or livestock if absolutely necessary. Warmth was communal, not always comfortable but effective. Our modern image of universal suffering also glosses over climate variation. Not every castle sat atop a blizzard-whipped mountain. Many stood in temperate zones where winter nights were brisk rather than brutal, particularly by medieval standards of expectation. Rural peasants in milder regions experienced winter differently from a Scottish laird enduring snowdrifts the size of ox carts. Cold is contextual. For someone accustomed to living with unglazed windows, a 45-degree night might seem downright balmy. What about the ever-dramatic stone freezer cliché? True, masonry radiates chill when unheated, but thickness cuts both ways. Once a castle's inner walls absorbed the day's hearth heat, the mass slowed temperature loss. Combine that with high ceilings trapping smoke and upper floors benefiting from rising warmth, and you have a building that, while never tropical, wasn't the Arctic cave legend sometimes claims. Clever design choices like inward-facing courtyards that blocked wind weren't accidental. Castle architects may have lacked thermostats, but they had common sense born of long winters. Myth also forgets human agency. People didn't passively suffer. They strategized. Bed curtains created a microclimate. Fur-lined garments doubled as pajamas. Ale or mulled wine wasn't decadence. It was a sanity saver. Communities stockpiled firewood and thatch months in advance, understanding winter preparation like an art. Even superstitions, charms, prayers, herb sachets reflect an earnest human drive to claim some control over the uncontrollable. Of course, survival wasn't equal. A noble's goose-down bolster trumped a stable boy's straw tick any night, but poor households still managed. Shared sleeping, humble hearths, and relentless improvisation kept bodies functioning. Mortality rates owed far more to famine, disease, and war than hypothermia alone. Did people occasionally freeze? Tragically, yes. Extreme storms, neglect or poverty could turn a bad night into the last one. Yet the overwhelming evidence shows most endured. Otherwise, medieval Europe would have resembled a snowbound graveyard rather than a bustling patchwork of villages, markets and castles, stubbornly humming with life. The romance, or horror of an icy chamber persists because drama sells better than pragmatism. Lord Geoffrey braved a mild chill and slept soundly is not gripping literature. Writers from the Victorians onward embellished drafts into Arctic gales to lend their histories Gothic flair. Archaeology and records, however, hint at a quieter truth. Folks made do, adapted and carried on. Warmth was relative, but survival was real. Humor helps us bridge the centuries. Picture a baron tugging on 3 wool caps, muttering about the curse of January, while his cook slides a glowing brick under the blankets. Imagine peasants gossiping around the fire, laughing off frost while planning tomorrow's chores. The cold was an adversary, yes, but not a death sentence by default. So, did medieval people shiver? Absolutely. Did they succumb en masse? Hardly. If they hadn't outwitted their drafty homes, you wouldn't be reading or listening to a chronicle of their lives. Instead, we'd all be marveling at beautifully preserved but tragically frozen ancestors. Humanity's stubbornness won. Clever rituals, architectural tweaks, and a dash of blind optimism turned stone fridge castles into survivable homes. In the end, the myth of endless frost is more about our thermostat-pampered astonishment than their plight. They didn't live in eternal discomfort. They lived, adapted, and often thrived. And that's why, centuries later, we're here swapping stories instead of thawing out lost lineage from beneath an ice crust. Medieval winters weren't cozy spa retreats, but they weren't instant popsicle factories either. Picture the world in the early 20th century. Factories thumped, trains clattered, radios crackled, and anything broken was mended with whatever string, cloth, or questionable optimism you had lying around. Hardware stores were temples of nails, screws, and swearing. Adhesives? Mostly for stationery and stamp collectors. If you wanted something truly stuck, you reached for a hammer, not a roll of tape, because that mythical roll didn't exist yet. Back then, fixing a tear meant one of 2 things. 1, get out your sewing kit and stitch like grandma at lightning speed, or 2, shrug, hope nobody notices, and pretend frayed cloth was the new fashion. Glue existed, sure, but it was usually animal-based, brittle, and smelled like it had been brewed in a goat's shoe. Forget flexible bonds. Most glue cracked faster than your patience. Rivets and bolts held metal together, but if you needed a quick patch on something flimsy, grab twine, say a prayer, and wish for luck. Waterproofing was less about science and more about positive thinking. Wooden crates got slathered with shellac or varnish and hoped the rain wouldn't laugh at the effort. Leather boots were waxed to within an inch of their lives, yet every puddle still found a way in. Tar paper patched roofs, but once it hardened, you had a surface as flexible as a bad mood. Farmers and mechanics spent more hours improvising fixes than actually using the thing they were fixing. Now imagine the 1930s military gear closet. Ammunition boxes, wood, steel, stubborn hinges, and a flair for rusting at the first hint of humidity. Tents, heavy canvas, prone to tearing at the worst moment, usually during a storm or, if fate was particularly cruel, under enemy fire. Belts, straps, and field packs. They broke, cracked, and stretched like a toddler's patience at bedtime. If you wanted to seal something, you reached for whatever you could tie, hammer or wedge. Soldiers and quartermasters became masters of improvisation. A snapped strap? Lace it together with cord. Leaky canteen? Smear wax over the seam and hope. Wooden rifle stock cracked? Bind it with wire and curse loudly. Everything took time, often precious time you didn't have when the clock was ticking and the sergeant was counting. Imagine hammering nails into a crate at 3 a.m. Watts, sweat stinging your eyes, while your commanding officer asks why you're redecorating instead of preparing for inspection. The problem wasn't laziness, it was the sheer lack of something quick and reliable. The army wanted airtight, watertight containers that opened fast, but reality delivered lids that jammed. crates that swelled in humidity, and rope bindings that slipped like buttered eels. Even civilian industries weren't much better off. Packing plants, shipping companies, and auto garages all fought the same enemy, time. Every repair was a project, every patch a gamble. One leaky seam could ruin an entire shipment or an entire day's mood. And let's not romanticize old-time craftsmanship. Sure, things were built to last, but also built to be annoying when they broke. Fixing a machine belt required tools, patience, and possibly divine intervention. Airplanes, mechanics tied wire and cloth in complex patterns, hoping aerodynamic forces wouldn't simply laugh and undo their handiwork mid-flight. Quick fix culture didn't exist. You fixed it right, or you didn't fix it at all, which was great in theory, but maddening when you needed a stopgap solution now. Workshops were a circus of desperate ingenuity. Need to seal a crack? Pour molten lead? Yes, lead into the gap, wave off the fumes, and call it progress. Need to stop a draft in a window? Ram cloth into it until you run out of cloth, patience, or both. Need to keep moisture out of a crate? Line it with oil-soaked paper and pray the shipment doesn't spontaneously combust. Safety guidelines were basically don't set yourself on fire. This was the reality soldiers, mechanics and warehouse workers carried into World War II. Every hour spent fiddling with cords, grommets and glue was an hour not spent on what really mattered: fighting, fixing or shipping. The craving for a miracle adhesive wasn't about laziness, it was about survival, efficiency, and keeping your sanity when everything around you creaked, leaked or broke. If you wanted something patched in 1939, you had to channel your inner MacGyver, decades before MacGyver was cool. A few nails, a strip of cloth, a lot of muttered words the chaplain wouldn't approve of, and voila, a temporary fix destined to fail at the most inconvenient moment. Everyone knew there had to be a faster, smarter way. The world was practically screaming, would someone invent a sticky miracle already? The stage was set, an age of industry racing into an age of war, armed with courage, clunky tools, and a roll of hope instead of tape. Into this chaos would step an unlikely hero, a factory worker with a sharp eye and an even sharper pen, ready to nudge history towards something truly revolutionary. But before she writes her famous letter, the world still creaks under the weight of broken hinges and frayed straps, held together by faith, friction, and a lot of wishful thinking. Some historical heroes ride into the story on horses, sabers flashing. Vesta Stout clocked in at the Green River Ordnance Plant in Illinois, hair pinned up, lunch pail in hand, and quietly changed military logistics forever. No drum rolls, no banners, just a sharp pair of eyes and the stubborn belief that there had to be a better way than watching soldiers wrestle ammunition crates like they were contestants in a particularly unglamorous wrestling match. By 1943, America's war machine was roaring. Factories hummed with an almost frantic rhythm, riveters hammering, conveyor belts rattling, workers turning out endless streams of bullets, bombs, and boxed-up supplies destined for Europe and the Pacific. Vesta, a mother of 2 sons already serving, joined thousands of women who traded aprons for overalls. She inspected and packaged rifle cartridges, meticulously sealing cardboard boxes, threading wax-coated strips to make them easy open, a term that was frankly optimistic at best. The problem leaped at her every day. Soldiers at the front needed ammunition fast, yet each cartridge box was wrapped, waxed, and bound in a ritual so fussy you half expected it to include a formal dance. Troops under fire didn't have 30 seconds to peel, pry, and curse while bullets whistled overhead. Vesta imagined her own sons fumbling with those boxes mid-battle and thought, with all the force of a mother who means business, absolutely not. She wasn't an engineer, chemist, or military strategist. She was, however, every bit the determined parent who fixes what's broken. She eyed those flimsy paper seals and concluded they might as well come with a note. Good luck, soldier. The existing wax strings snapped, jammed, or refused to cooperate. And once wet, the packaging was about as trustworthy as a cardboard umbrella. So Vesta began sketching an idea in her mind, a strip strong enough to keep moisture out, yet willing to rip obediently when a soldier yanked. No chisels, no knives, no muttered profanities, just pull, open, reload, survive. A miracle? Not really. She had spent years patching everything from children's toys to leaky chicken coops at home. The concept of something sticky and tough wasn't wizardry, it was common sense. The ordnance plant had its routines and red tape, big government contracts, standardized procedures, endless paperwork. Vesta didn't wait for an official suggestion box. She took the boldest shortcut imaginable, right directly to the commander-in-chief. Most people scribble the president about taxes or road funding. Vesta essentially said, "Mr. Roosevelt, I think our troops need better tape." Her letter, dated February 1943, was firm but respectful. She explained the maddening slowness of ammo box openings, described her proposed solution, a waterproof fabric-reinforced hand-tiered strip, and appealed to Roosevelt as both president and father. She attached diagrams drawn with the precision of a woman tired of watching bureaucracy stall good ideas. There was no fanfare, no self-promotion, just plain talk. This will save time, this will save lives. It's worth pausing on the boldness here. Imagine a line worker today bypassing management and firing off an email to the Oval Office. Most would assume it goes straight into the void, yet wartime urgency had a way of clearing clutter. Her letter landed on someone's desk who recognized its practicality and forwarded it up the chain, all the way to Roosevelt himself. Vesta had skipped the corporate ladder entirely. Humor aside, her intuition was flawless. She knew the stakes weren't just inconvenience, they were measured in seconds under fire. Every moment a soldier spent fumbling with waxed paper was a moment he wasn't firing back or moving to cover. Her proposed tape, she argued, would slash opening times and keep moisture from spoiling the cartridges in the first place. That's a sales pitch no general could ignore. She wasn't a scientist, one might quip, just a mum on a mission to stop the military from wrestling with boxes like they were opening stubborn pickles. But history tends to reward that brand of quiet ingenuity. Her initiative underlined a truth the war constantly proved. Sometimes the simplest ideas come from the factory floor, not the ivory tower. By spring, the War Production Board had caught wind of her suggestion. Engineers began considering how to manufacture a cloth-backed rubber adhesive strip with a protective waterproof coat, easy to tear, easy to apply, cheap to roll out in miles of glorious stickiness. Vesta's name wasn't emblazoned on headlines, but the gears of change had begun turning because she dared to speak up. There's something cinematic about this moment. A woman in a wartime plant, oil on her hands, drafting a letter that would pivot an entire supply chain. No committees, no consultants, just resolve. Most people assumed innovation trickled down from generals and industrialists. Vesta flipped the script, proving a single voice could ripple across oceans. When Roosevelt read that letter, he didn't see a complaint. He saw a solution packaged neatly in sincerity. A mum defending her sons, an employee defending the efficiency of a workforce, an American defending common sense. She mailed her idea into the heart of the war effort and unwittingly into the annals of invention. That unassuming correspondence would open the door for one of the most practical, beloved tools of the 20th century. The gluey revolution had its prophet, and her name wasn't Edison or Bell, but Vesta Stout, the woman who thought a strip of sticky cloth might just save lives. History, as it turns out, often hinges on the people willing to say, "This could work better," and actually do something about it. A presidential letter moves faster than a factory rumor. Once Roosevelt saw Vesta Stout's sensible plea for a strong waterproof strip soldiers can actually open without inventing new swear words, he didn't toss it in a drawer. He pushed it toward the War Production Board, the wartime traffic controller for every rivet, rifle, and ration bar America churned out. In 1943, that office wielded the power of 100 clipboards and 1,000 deadlines. If they nodded yes, things happened. The board recognized Vesta's idea for what it was: cheap, practical, and potentially life-saving. And unlike some military proposals, jetpacks, invisible tanks, this one didn't require rewriting the laws of physics, just some sticky ingenuity. They needed a manufacturer nimble enough to experiment under pressure. Enter Johnson & Johnson, a company already fluent in bandages, medical tape, and making the impossible feel vaguely sanitary. Johnson & Johnson's adhesive pedigree went back decades. Their Permacell division had quietly become the wizard behind countless industrial tapes, producing rolls sturdy enough to strap down a toddler during a sugar rush. Not recommended, but you get the picture. Wartime America adored them because their bandages stayed put when grit, sweat, and chaos conspired against every other product. When the War Production Board said, "We want a strip tough enough for battle, but gentle enough to rip by hand," Permacell barely blinked. Challenge accepted. Picture the design table in 1943. Engineers in white coats stare at ammo boxes, tug at wax strings, and mutter phrases like, "We can do better than this paper nonsense." They brainstorm materials: a rubber-based adhesive for flexibility and serious stick, duck cloth fabric, tightly woven cotton, as stubborn as a mule, and a polyethylene coating to shed water like, well, a duck's back. Duct tape, someone says, probably over lukewarm coffee, and the nickname sticks before the glue even sets. They start rolling out prototypes, literal rolls, yards upon yards of dull army green, cut into strips that clung like ivy but surrendered when yanked. Soldiers wouldn't need knives, teeth, or divine blessings, just fingers and the will to pull. It was a small miracle, durable in mud, forgiving under frost, and less temperamental than an angry quartermaster. The science was straightforward but satisfying. Rubber adhesive gave the tape muscle, letting it hug wood, metal, canvas, or anything shy of a greased pig. The fabric backing meant strength without brittleness. Rip it lengthwise or crosswise and it behaved, splitting neatly instead of shredding into tragic spaghetti. Finally, the protective waterproof coat kept rain, humidity, and the occasional tropical monsoon from turning the tape into sad, soggy confetti. No one called it rocket science. It was closer to "why didn't we do this 10 years ago?" Johnson & Johnson had something special, a product the army didn't just tolerate but clamored for. And in wartime, clamor equals contracts. Production scaled fast. Permacell's machines spun out miles of sticky salvation every week, shipping reels of duct tape, yes, spelled like the bird at first, straight into the beating logistical heart of the Allied forces. The reception from field reports was almost giddy by military standards. Soldiers patched tent rips in seconds, sealed leaky canteens, lashed gear, and finally opened ammo boxes without reenacting a wrestling match. Johnson & Johnson, one wag joked, because saving lives is good, but saving your sanity while opening ammo boxes is priceless. Commanders agreed. Every minute saved fumbling with wax string was a minute aimed at surviving the next barrage. Of course, nothing spreads faster than a good idea in wartime. Units started using the tape for everything, holding splintered rifle stocks together, fashioning impromptu straps, even binding cracked helmets until proper repair. Rumor has it, an enterprising mechanic even used a roll to hush a rattling Jeep hood, field-approved noise reduction. Each new improvisation cemented the tape's legend. Engineers designed it. Soldiers gave it a soul. Behind the spreadsheets, the partnership had subtle genius. The War Production Board didn't reinvent the wheel. They found experts already rolling wheels downhill and simply said, "Roll faster." Johnson & Johnson, with decades of sticky credibility, proved that the best wartime innovations weren't always flashy. Sometimes they were humble, greyish-green, and quietly life-saving. Humorist hindsight tempts us to imagine boardrooms chanting slogans, "Finally a tape tougher than a sergeant's language on inspection day," but the truth is less theatrical and more telling. This was wartime pragmatism at its best. Government and industry skipping the dance of endless approvals, forging ahead with a solution so obvious you wonder why the universe hadn't coughed it up sooner. By late 1943, duct tape wasn't an experiment, it was inventory. Crates of cartridges went out sheathed in confidence, no longer hostage to humidity or human patience. The invention blurred the line between weapon and tool. It didn't shoot, explode, or intimidate, yet in its quiet way, it saved soldiers from needless risk. A simple roll of adhesive joined rifles, rations and helmets as essential gear. Thus the sticky partnership thrived. Vesta Stout had sparked it, Roosevelt had nudged it, the War Production Board had blessed it, and Johnson & Johnson's Permacell had birthed it. What began as a frustrated factory worker's notion had matured into a logistical workhorse rolling steadily toward battlefields around the globe. No headlines proclaimed, "America invents miracle tape," but on the ground the proof was in every patched crate, every dry cartridge, every soldier spared a needless scuffle with soggy packaging. Quiet revolutions rarely get parades, but they change the world just the same. One tear-by-hand strip at a time, a roll of tape is a humble thing, until the battlefield turns it into a survival tool. By late 1943, Johnson & Johnson's green duct tape was arriving in crates right alongside rifles and rations. Nobody threw a parade for it, but the first soldiers to tear a strip and slap it on a leaking ammo box must have felt like they'd discovered sorcery. This wasn't the brittle wax string they'd cursed for months. This was an obedient, waterproof strip that stuck where it landed. Within weeks, the tape's reputation spread faster than latrine gossip. Ammo boxes, once sealed like they were guarding national secrets, popped open with a single satisfying rip. Soldiers didn't have to hack, pry, or gnaw their way to cartridges. In the middle of a firefight, shaving seconds mattered. The tape turned what used to be a maddening ritual into a quick flick of the wrist. Half the war effort was courage. The other half, it turned out, was adhesive. Then the improvisation began. Frontline conditions mocked manuals. Gear broke, tents tore, boots split, and nobody had time to file a repair ticket. If it moved and shouldn't, tape it. If it didn't move and should, hit it with a wrench. WW2 maintenance doctrine in a nutshell. Soldiers lived that mantra daily. Tent seams ripped in midnight storms. Duct tape. Rifle sling phrase just before a patrol. Duct tape. Helmet liner cracks after an unfriendly meeting with shrapnel. A few strips and you're back in the game. Slightly more stylish than before. The waterproofing abilities quickly became legend. In the Pacific, where humidity tried to dissolve everything, men wrapped knife handles, flashlight seams, and even the mouths of canteens. European winter, same tape, now doubling as windproofing for drafty boots and gloves. Jeeps developed personality quirks at inconvenient times, loose mirrors, rattling dashboards, cracked hoses. Mechanics grabbed tape and invented fixes that would horrify an engineer but delighted every driver trying to get home alive. One infantryman reportedly swore his foxhole roof stayed drier after he layered tape across seams like shingles. Was it elegant? No. Did it keep rain out? Absolutely. Another squad used strips to strap a broken field radio antenna back together, turning an expensive paperweight into a functional lifeline. The role was earning nicknames: GI's best friend, the green lifesaver, and less printable titles uttered with pure gratitude. Even medics caught on. Officially, duct tape wasn't approved for first aid, but emergencies laugh at paperwork. A deep cut, tape over a bandage kept it from unraveling mid-march. Blisters from endless miles? A thin strip reduced friction better than half the foot powders in the kit. A splint needed reinforcement? 3 turns of tape turned wobbly wood into something approaching stability. Nobody suggested replacing surgical sutures, but out in the mud, good enough to stop bleeding until morning beat perfection by a mile. Naval crews were equally inventive. Salt water liked to corrode every seam on a ship. Sailors, pragmatic to the bone, wrapped hatch handles, patched small deck leaks, and even quieted rattling metal plates during storms with tape. An aircraft carrier didn't exactly hinge on one roll, but hundreds of tiny fixes meant fewer distractions when the sea turned ugly. The Air Corps, same story. Bomber crews were notorious for taping instrument panels, dangling wires, and rattling nose cones. One pilot joked that his B-17 had more tape than paint. He wasn't far off anything to stop a panel from buzzing like a kazoo at 10,000 feet. Flexible, sticky, and tearable by hand, the tape was tailor-made for last-minute patch jobs when a sortie couldn't wait for a hangar overhaul. What startled commanders wasn't just how well the tape worked, but how fast the troops trusted it. A supply sergeant might distribute a dozen rolls, and by week's end, every roll had vanished into a jungle of battlefield creativity. It wasn't hoarding, it was survival instinct. When you've seen rain roll off a taped seam instead of soaking ammunition, you stop questioning miracles. Duct tape also had morale value, fixing something instantly, without requisition forms, without waiting for replacement parts, gave soldiers a fleeting sense of control in a world defined by chaos. There's quiet psychological relief in slapping a strip across a problem and declaring, "handled." A private might not influence strategy, but at least his leaking canteen would stop watering the inside of his pack. The tape's quiet heroism rarely made war bulletins. Generals briefed maps, maneuvers, and tonnage, not the anecdote of a platoon patching their command tent 5 minutes before a downpour. Yet thousands of soldiers privately knew this roll of sticky cloth saved headaches, man-hours, and maybe lives. By war's end, duct tape wasn't just a commodity, it was a habit. Packs weren't considered ready until someone tossed in a fresh roll. As the front lines shifted and victory edged closer, one truth stuck, literally. In a war defined by tanks, bombers, and monumental industry, sometimes survival hinged on humble tools. A little green tape kept water out, kept ammo dry, and kept weary soldiers sane. Every frayed strap patched, every crate sealed, every shivering night made drier proved the same lesson. Bravery wins battles, but a reliable adhesive keeps the lights on. When the last artillery shell echoed into silence and soldiers packed their duffel bags, one unlikely souvenir marched home with them, a roll of sticky olive-green magic. War veterans had seen duct tape still duct tape to them, plug bullet holes in tents, seal crates through monsoon downpours, and hold a Jeep mirror together longer than the Jeep itself. To them, life without that humble strip of fabric and glue now felt barbaric. It's no wonder that, when they returned to a country suddenly obsessed with white picket fences and picture-perfect homes, they smuggled rolls of it into civilian life like a secret weapon for creaky floors and squeaky screen doors. The United States of the late 1940s was in the midst of a building frenzy. GI loans, baby booms, and a national itch for fresh wallpaper meant new suburbs were sprouting faster than dandelions. Every street brimmed with half-painted shutters, contractors balancing precariously on ladders, and homeowners muttering, "It'll hold until next weekend." Into this chaos stepped a tape so forgiving, so ready to wrap around any leaky joint, that it practically begged to be part of the post-war toolkit. Soldiers who once used it to waterproof foxholes now slapped it onto leaky garden hoses with the same tactical seriousness. Homeowners quickly realized they didn't need military clearance to enjoy its talents. Plumbing leak? Tape it. The family dog chewed the couch? Tape it. Little Timmy's model airplane lost a wing? Tape it until aviation authorities can be consulted. Suddenly fathers everywhere strutted around their garages like field marshals of domestic repairs. The phrase "let's grab the tape" became an heirloom of household vocabulary, spoken with the solemnity usually reserved for blessings over dinner. The big leap, however, came with the rise of modern heating and air conditioning. Central systems were spreading across suburbia like a cool, conditioned breeze. Miles of metal ductwork twisted through attics and basements, carrying comfort to every room. Unfortunately, those shiny metal seams loved to leak air about as much as teenagers love ignoring curfews. Enter the manufacturers, eager to rebrand this ex-military wonder for civilian glory. Olive drab didn't exactly scream kitchen-friendly, so they dressed it in a fetching silver coat, matching the ducts it would soon embrace. Silver wasn't just stylish, it made homeowners feel like NASA engineers every time they patched a gap, and so duct tape waddled gracefully into duct tape. The spelling shifted partly by accident, partly by marketing. After all, no suburban dad wanted to admit he was relying on waterfowl to keep his heating bill low. Duct tape, meanwhile, sounded like something approved by bespectacled men with clipboards. The rebrand made sense. The tape's future lay not in foxholes but in crawl spaces. Soon, hardware stores proudly stacked gleaming rolls beside nails and varnish, promising a seamless solution to every drafty vent. It wasn't just HVAC systems basking in its adhesive embrace. Weekend warriors discovered its knack for binding cracked rakes, holding sagging window screens, and silencing rattling storm windows. Before long, duct tape became a quiet hero of household sanity. Where glue dripped, screws stripped, and putty crumbled, duct tape soldiered on with stoic resolve. It was the domestic whisperer, persuading squeaky cabinet doors to hush and coaxing broken toys into one last encore before the trash bin. The cultural migration of duct tape mirrored the country's shift from wartime grit to peacetime ambition. Veterans who once repaired bullet-scarred vehicles now used the same gestures to repair squeaky floorboards. The tape bridged two worlds, a memory of hardship and a tool for hope. A single strip carried echoes of muddy trenches even as it gleamed in the tidy kitchens of Levittown. That contradiction gave duct tape an almost mythical aura. It wasn't merely adhesive, it was proof that a nation that once mended tanks could now mend toasters. Advertising caught on, though it never needed much theatrics. Unlike other post-war innovations, television, Tupperware, or instant cake mixes, duct tape didn't have to convince anyone of its usefulness. One demo at the hardware counter, patching a metal pipe while the clerk kept talking, and skeptical husbands were sold. Wives, tired of nagging about that draft under the stairs, practically threw rolls into shopping baskets. Children saw it as permission to build cardboard fortresses with industrial authenticity. And then there was the undeniable aesthetic. Silver matched practically nothing, yet clashed with nothing either. A neutral badge of quick-thinking ingenuity. Seeing a bit of duct tape on a furnace vent said, someone cared enough to fix this before frostbite set in. Its sheen became a subtle signal of thrift and resourcefulness, qualities the post-war middle class wore proudly. This home improvement stardom transformed duct tape from a military relic into an everyman's badge of competence, just as returning soldiers transformed from warriors into suburban fathers. So too did their sticky ally transform from battle-hardened savior to handyman's confidant. One decade it stopped rain from rusting ammunition, the next it stopped cold air from bankrupting families. That's an enviable resume, even for an inanimate object. The migration from duct to duct also carried a bit of unintentional humor. Despite the spelling change, the tape wasn't particularly good at long-term duct sealing. Later studies revealed heat and age could peel it loose, but by then the name had stuck as firmly as the tape itself. Americans didn't care. They'd seen it hold cars together, patch boats, and rescue countless DIY projects from calamity. The truth was irrelevant when your basement vent was whistling like a tea kettle. From foxhole heroics to furnace maintenance, duct tape's pivot was a masterclass in career reinvention. Few products can boast a legacy that stretches from saving soldiers' sanity to saving suburbanites' heating bills. The tape didn't just survive peacetime, it thrived, trading muddy trenches for manicured lawns without missing a beat. Your ducts were never so stylishly silver, nor your toolbox so smugly prepared. By the mid-1950s, duct tape had already conquered attics, garages, and a fair portion of the human imagination. Yet something curious happened as the decades rolled toward bell-bottoms and disco. An adhesive that was born in wartime grit started sprouting legends. It wasn't just a tool anymore. It was the secret handshake of anyone who believed stubborn determination, plus a roll of silver, could fix just about anything this fragile planet hurled at them. Every decade found a new altar on which to worship the sticky idol. The 1950s were prime time for gadgetry and do-it-yourself optimism. Magazines like Popular Mechanics gushed over miracle materials, and duct tape earned more column inches than some elected officials. Post-war dads posed in grainy photographs holding up patched lawn chairs as if they'd personally invented metallurgy. Children learned early that a ripped kite was no tragedy, just a job for that silver ribbon from Dad's toolbox. The phrase, "It's nothing a little tape can't fix," became a suburban lullaby, chanted whenever the washing machine clanked ominously. By the 1960s, duct tape's mythic profile started creeping into places less Norman Rockwell, more Jetsons. NASA, with its habit of demanding quick, robust solutions in places where call a plumber wasn't an option, treated duct tape like a sacred relic. Engineers appreciated its trifecta of properties: lightweight, decent heat resistance, and willingness to cling to basically anything shy of raw sunbeams. Space capsules might have looked like marvels of science, but inside they contained a humble roll of silver reassurance strapped next to multi-million-dollar instruments. Apollo 13 cemented duct tape's cosmic resume. In April 1970, 3 astronauts faced a failing carbon dioxide filter 200,000 miles from Earth. The solution? Improvised adapter, cardboard, plastic bags, and cue dramatic pause, duct tape. Mission Control's mantra essentially boiled down to build a life-saving device with whatever's on board. Without that tape, Tom Hanks never would have gotten a movie deal decades later. The entire ordeal elevated duct tape from garage companion to celestial savior. Who needs divine intervention when you have 5 yards of sticky fabric and a steady hand? While NASA was quietly scripting legends, back on Earth the tape's pop culture swagger blossomed. Car enthusiasts discovered that a busted bumper could be disguised with temporary strips. Temporary in the same way we'll paint the house next spring is temporary. Campers discovered that tent poles, torn tarps, and even a coffee-stained sleeping bag could be mummified into usability. Fishermen wrapped cracked oars, hunters sealed leaky boots, and teenagers realized a roll in the glove compartment was cheaper than calling Dad for rescue. By the 1970s, a folk saying gained traction: if you can't fix it with duct tape, you didn't use enough. It spread faster than shag carpeting. Hardware stores leaned into the motto, printing it on t-shirts and countersigns. This wasn't marketing fluff. It was a genuine creed among weekend warriors who saw the tape as a bandage for pride as much as for plywood. That loose rearview mirror after a regrettable encounter with a mailbox. Duct tape it. No need to confess human error when silver heroism could quietly hold everything in place. The 1980s supercharged the mythology thanks to television's love affair with improbable problem solvers. Although the show MacGyver didn't premiere until mid-decade, the archetype it celebrated, a resourceful hero fashioning gadgets out of household junk, was already alive in garages across America. When viewers watched MacGyver construct an escape device with a Swiss Army knife and a roll of duct tape, millions nodded knowingly. Of course, that's exactly how I fixed the lawnmower. The tape's legend became self-reinforcing. The more outrageous the stories, the more people tried to outdo them. Car culture, too, kept fanning the flames. Long before plastic zip ties and epoxy epiphanies, duct tape was the shade tree mechanic's insurance policy. Radiator hose leaking? Wrap it. Tail light cracked? Tape a patch of red cellophane and call it innovation. Road trip lore is studded with tales of families limping across state lines with half their fender resembling origami, held together by adhesive determination. Highway patrols shook heads, but motorists just smiled smugly. They knew the tape wasn't elegant, it was effective, and elegance doesn't get you to grandma's house. Meanwhile, camping and scouting manuals lauded duct tape as the wilderness first aid kit you can't forget. Stripped gear loops, busted tent zippers, leaky water bottles, all succumbed to silver salvation. Stories trickled back from mountain expeditions of climbers patching torn parkas mid-blizzard. Urban explorers swore by it for securing flashlights or covering sharp edges. Each anecdote, whether mundane or heroic, layered new myth onto old reality. Underlying the humor and hyperbole was an emotional truth. Duct tape symbolized self-reliance. It whispered, no matter how absurd the crisis, you've got a fighting chance if you can wrap it. That confidence mattered in an age oscillating between nuclear anxiety and technological wonder. Duct tape was the quiet constant, unpretentious, ageless, unfazed by either existential dread or disco balls. By the late 1980s, you couldn't attend a car rally, camping jamboree, or even a county fair without spotting duct-taped contraptions that defied engineering textbooks. People fashioned wallets, book covers, even prom dresses as tongue-in-cheek tributes. Each creation winked at the shared cultural joke, The tape might have been designed for ducts, but destiny had bigger plans. Call it mythology, call it marketing serendipity. By the time MacGyver started detonating plot lines with little more than ingenuity and adhesive, the audience already believed duct tape wasn't just sticky, it was an archetype of persistence, proof that civilization was only a few wraps away from holding itself together, a band-aid for your house, your car, and occasionally your ego. And unlike fashion trends, duct tape didn't care if you wore flares or shoulder pads. It simply waited patiently for the next mishap, roll at the ready, chuckling somewhere in its silver soul. Try me. History books devote whole chapters to tanks, treaties, and generals with immaculate mustaches. But lurking in every junk drawer, workshop, and glove box is a quieter monument to human ingenuity, a humble grey roll that refuses to be ignored. Empires rise, empires crumble, and duct tape, it just keeps sticking around, smug in its immortality. Post-war silver gave way to a rainbow. Somewhere in the late 20th century, manufacturers collectively decided utilitarian grey wasn't enough for a species obsessed with accessorizing. Today, duct tape shows up in camouflage, neon pink, checkerboard, glow-in-the-dark, even patterns that look like flaming skulls if you squint. Gorilla tape, a burlier cousin, swaggered onto shelves boasting thicker backing and adhesive strong enough to scare professional glues. NASA commissioned space-rated versions that shrug at vacuum and temperature swings. It's no longer a single roll, it's an entire sticky dynasty. That flexibility explains why you can walk into a hardware store and feel like you're picking paint samples rather than adhesives. Repairing a garden hose, classic grey. Wrapping a kid's science fair rocket, electric blue. Binding the family canoe after Uncle Dave's optimistic portage, camo, obviously, so the river doesn't judge. The sheer choice says less about marketing and more about a truth humanity quietly admits. We like a quick fix, and we want it to look fabulous. Pop culture noticed. Duct tape wallets became a teenage rite of passage, proof you could both craft and defy fashion simultaneously. Online tutorials spawned duct tape roses, evening gowns, even suits bold enough to crash a wedding. High schools across North America hosted duct tape prom contests, where couples strutted in outfits shinier than disco balls, sweating but triumphant, whispering, "No one can sit down comfortably, but by heaven we sparkle." Memes keep the legend sticky in digital minds. Every few months, social feeds resurface a photo of a car bumper mummified in tape or a lawn chair reconstructed like a Frankenstein recliner. Captions read, "Professional repair? Nah. Legendary improvisation." It's affectionate mockery. People laugh, but secretly bookmark the image for the day they discover a suspicious rattle in the washing machine. Culturally, duct tape evolved from tool to statement. It represents stubborn optimism, that unshakable belief that you can wrestle chaos into submission with sheer adhesive willpower. Consider why your toolbox, no matter how minimalist, still shelters a roll. It's not just for sealing ducts, it's a talisman. Life springs leaks, pipes, plans, relationships. Having that roll within arm's reach feels like you've outwitted entropy at least until the coffee maker sputters again. Modern engineering hasn't dethroned it. Laser cutters, 3D printers, epoxy miracles, none have dented duct tape's reign. Fancy gadgets assume ideal conditions. Duct tape thrives precisely where conditions laugh at manuals. Torn kayak mid-trip? Tape. Broken Christmas ornament an hour before guests arrive? Tape. Air conditioning vent humming like a kazoo at midnight? Tape. It's not that the tape is magical, it's that it buys time, sanity, and sometimes a full night's sleep. NASA, ever loyal, still tucks custom rolls onto spacecraft. Astronauts practice contingency patching, which is official speak for "we're a few strips away from disaster." That quiet inclusion speaks volumes. Centuries after kings fell and colonies rose, human survival occasionally depends on fabric plus glue. In a vacuum, duct tape doesn't just patch holes, it patches existential dread. The psychology is telling. Reaching for duct tape is an act of hope. I can fix this, at least enough to get by. A ripped screen door, a cracked bin, a chair leg wobbling like it's auditioning for slapstick. None are crises, if the tape is near. It democratizes repair. You don't need degrees, blueprints, or a Viking forge. You need a steady hand, a torn edge, and confidence that the world can be persuaded to behave. Even as maker culture blooms, duct tape stays relevant because it's instant, tactile, and forgiving. You're not committing to permanence. You're creating breathing room. Plenty of temporary fixes last decades, an unintentional testament to laziness or genius, often both. Ask any homeowner who swore to call the contractor next week in 1997 while still admiring the same silver patch. Humor aside, the role teaches something profound. In an age obsessed with planned obsolescence, duct tape champions resourcefulness. It whispers, don't throw it away yet. Maybe, just maybe, it still has life. That mindset preserves more than broken gadgets. It preserves resilience. Empires may collapse, currencies may wobble, but as long as there's tape, humans will jury-rig hope. So yes, tanks shaped wars, treaties reshaped borders, and technology reshaped existence. Yet on the quiet continuum of survival tools, duct tape earns a permanent footnote, maybe even a bold heading. History remembers the headline acts. Households remember the saviors in drawers. Every rip, every wrap, every gleaming patch is a love letter to pragmatism. Next time you open that drawer and see a tired grey roll staring back, appreciate the lineage, from battlefield mud to suburban basements, from lunar modules to neon prom nights. Duct tape has crossed decades with no intention of retiring. Empires rise and fall, but duct tape sticks around, and that, more than most treaties, might be humanity's real safety net. The first light over Rome didn't so much gently break as it barged in with a rooster's battle cry and a mule squeaking under an overloaded cart. Before the invention of coffee, this was the eternal city's idea of a wake-up call. Clucking poultry, creaking axles, and a chorus of shop shutters snapping open. If serenity was on your morning wish list, you moved to the countryside, or at least pretended you couldn't hear your neighbor's goat head butting the water jar again. Long before anyone dared leave the house, most Roman families turned toward their lares and penates, the household guardian spirits and pantry protectors. These weren't just decorative figurines gathering dust. They got fresh offerings of wine, a pinch of salt, maybe a crumb of bread, because angering the spirit responsible for your grain jar was a fast track to moldy dinners. Fathers often murmured a prayer while adjusting their toga. Children peeked sleepily at the tiny altar, and mothers double-checked the oil lamp to make sure the gods didn't feel ignored. Think of it as a divine good morning text, minus the emojis. Rome awoke like an orchestra tuning. Only every instrument was slightly broken. Iron-rimmed cartwheels ground against cobbles. Donkey drivers shouted insults that would scandalize a sailor, and hawkers tried to outsell one another before sunrise. Fishermen lugged dripping nets from the Tiber. Bakers hauled steaming flatbread to stalls. One unlucky slave was already sweeping the villa courtyard, muttering oaths about pigeons and their lack of bladder discipline. Overhead, seagulls cackled as if laughing at everyone's rent payments. The city's noise wasn't a nuisance. It was proof Rome still thrummed with life. Temples chimed bells, gongs, or in one case, banged an old bronze shield to announce morning sacrifices. Picture it. Priests in flowing togas barely awake, fumbling amphora lids, while a goat gave a bleat of existential dread, an entire opera before breakfast. A Roman morning wardrobe malfunction could decide your social fate, tying the folds wrong, amateur dropping your fibula, the brooch, into yesterday's bathwater. Embarrassing. Early risers inspected their reflection in polished bronze mirrors, not so much for vanity as survival. A badly wrapped toga could whisper to the world, "I'm incompetent, please overcharge me for olives." Wealthier citizens had slaves to drape the garment. Poorer folk wrestled fabric alone, occasionally emerging swaddled like an accidental mummy, the macella. Open-air markets stirred as sunbeams struck marble columns. Merchants arranged dates, figs and vegetables with strategic flair. hoping to snag early buyers. Bargaining didn't wait until mid-morning. Even at first light, arguments about lentil pricing echoed louder than temple chants. Street corner philosophers, never deterred by dawn, prepared their speeches on virtue, or why onions prove the cosmos has meaning. Their reward? Pigeons and the occasional curious passerby. Inside a typical insular apartment block, life unfolded with rhythmic predictability. Mothers untangled sleeping children from wool blankets, coaxing them upright with promises of bread dipped in honey. Slaves dashed between chores, sweeping, hauling amphorae of water from street fountains, lighting small braziers. Firewood cracked, laundry creaked against wooden basins. Upstairs neighbors cursed downstairs neighbors for pounding grain too enthusiastically. The smell of oil lamps giving way to baking bread was the city's version of an alarm clock. Religion wasn't a weekend hobby. It laced through every sunrise, even the mundane. A merchant tying his sandals could involve muttering, "Fortuna, don't mess me over today." Military veterans polished small statuettes of Mars. Farmers pressed hands together toward Vesta for hearth protection. To modern eyes, these gestures blur into superstition, but for Romans, ignoring them risked cosmic chaos. Better a small wine spill on the hearth than the gods gossiping behind your back. Ancient letters and satirical poems hint at resigned amusement about Rome's ungodly hour. Picture a groggy senator, quill in hand. The cock crowed thrice, and so did my neighbor after last night's wine. Complainers still trudged to the forum, muttering about the infernal din, while secretly pleased they weren't living in a barbarian hut with only wolves for company. By the time sunlight glinted off the Capitoline temples, the city's arteries pulsed with humanity. Couriers hustled with tablets tucked under arms. Street performers juggled knives for yawning crowds, and magistrates practiced their stern, "I'm important" faces. The horizon promised politics, arguments, maybe a riot over grain prices. But for now, Rome stood on tiptoe, shaking the sleep from its marble shoulders. The good news? The gods might bless your day. The bad news? So might your neighbor's goat. And with that comforting thought, the eternal city marched into morning, noisy, fragrant, and undeniably alive. If dawn in Rome was all rooster insults and street racket, the next act in the morning drama was quieter, but no less essential: Helentaculum, the light meal that stood between a citizen and fainting in the forum. This wasn't the feast of champions. It was more like an edible pep talk. Picture a thin wedge of bread, maybe a shaving of cheese, a drizzle of olive oil, and a goblet of wine that was at least half water, because in Roman math, dilution equaled dignity. Breakfast didn't energize you, it politely suggested survival. Most households didn't even cook for the occasion. Bread was life's scaffolding, and the city's bakers had been sweating since midnight, coaxing dough to rise while everyone else muttered at the rooster. The smell of fresh loaves drifted through the alleys like an early bribe from the gods, luring slaves and errand boys into serpentine queues at the neighborhood ovens. A practical Roman knew the trick was timing. Arrive too late, and your morning bread resembled a paving stone with sesame seeds. Marketplace chatter made the cobblestones hum. Bakers shouted the merits of their round loaves, extolling crustiness as if it were a virtue of the Senate. Olive sellers claimed their jars contained liquid sunlight, promising even a dull morning could taste divine. Cheese merchants wagged blocks of salted curd like trophies, and somewhere, a fishmonger insisted that salted anchovies were the breakfast of heroes, though many Romans considered that a dare. The scene was part commerce, part street theatre, each hawker inventing slogans faster than Cicero could draft a speech. Inside homes and insular apartments, the ritual of dividing the bounty unfolded with quiet choreography. Slaves sliced bread with practiced flicks, brushed crumbs into their palms, and set aside the choicest pieces for the master. Children gnawed at crusts while still rubbing sleep from their eyes, leaving trails of flour across their tunics. Wealthier families might drizzle imported honey over their bread, an indulgence that transformed a humble meal into an edible sunrise. Poorer households relied on whatever spread was left over from the previous day, a scrap of garum paste perhaps, or an olive mashed to heroic thinness. The wine cup stood ready not to intoxicate but to hydrate and disinfect. Roman water supplies were ambitious yet far from pristine, so mixing wine was the ancient equivalent of a health hack. A measured pour, a generous splash of water, and the morning's social lubrication was complete. Stoic fathers sipped, silently approving the ratio, while young men tried to look worldly by swirling diluted wine as if appraising a vintage. Nobody fooled anyone, but the ritual lent the illusion of sophistication to a cupful of practicality. Breakfast also served as a moment of whispered planning. Merchants discussed contracts, mothers eyed the dwindling olive jar with suspicion, and apprentices rehearsed excuses for tardiness. Even at a table bare of ornament, the meal linked the household together, a brief calm before everyone scattered to the winds of Roman obligation. The slave assigned to haul water eyed the empty amphora with resignation, while the teenager dreaming of gladiator glory pushed crumbs around his plate, convinced the gods were sending him bigger adventures than barley bread. Not every Roman household followed the same script. Senators in marble-clad villas might supplement their morning with fruit, imported dates, or a few nuts presented in polished bowls, the kind of detail that whispered, "We're winning at life." Artisans in cramped tenements made do with whatever could be grabbed en route to work, a crust stuffed into a cloth pouch, a quick gulp of wine that had seen better amphorae. Yet rich or poor, the ritual was less about indulgence and more about readiness, arming body and mind against a day of haggling, marching, politicking, or surviving the crowded bathhouse queue. Writers of the period joked about the morning economy. One wit observed that a baker's shout can make even a miser generous before noon, hinting at the powerful aroma-driven marketing strategy Rome perfected long before billboards. Satirists teased their neighbors for overdunking bread until it dissolved into porridge, proof that even ancient Romans had opinions about breakfast etiquette. Through humor, the meal revealed its dual nature, humble and universal, yet flexible enough to host both cynicism and joy. By the time the last crumb was swept and the wine cup drained, the household began its centrifugal dance toward daily duties. Merchants headed for stalls, tutors prepared to coax Latin declensions from restless children, and artisans tightened their belts, literally and metaphorically. The gods had been greeted, the belly minimally appeased, and now the city beckoned with promises of business, gossip, and the occasional tax collector ambush. Breakfast was finished, but the day's real theatre was just raising its curtain. By mid-morning, the sleepy yawns of dawn and the faint dignity of bread and wine breakfast gave way to a spectacle of organized mayhem, the Forum Romanum, stirring like a beehive prodded with a stick. Here, the beating civic heart of the Republic and later the Empire kept its peculiar rhythm, equal parts ambition and shouting. The Forum was half Wall Street, half reality TV, minus the commercials, and it smelled faintly of olive oil and ambition as the sun sharpened the marble edges of temples and basilicas. Every paving stone seemed to sprout a new argument. Senators, their togas meticulously folded, glided down from the curia like white doves with power issues, casting meaningful glances at colleagues and discreetly measuring political wins. Merchants unrolled bolts of cloth, letting sunlight gild the colors to lure passers-by. Advocates strutted with wax tablets and styluses, practicing opening statements in tones that suggested Cicero's ghost was grading their performance. Business was rarely quiet. Ironmongers hawked nails by the pound, scribes promised flawless contracts for a modest fee, and money changers clinked bronze asses against silver denarii, arguing over exchange rates as if Jupiter himself might step in to arbitrate. Traders bellowed across the square about the superior weave of their Spanish wool or the tenderness of their Capuan figs, voices overlapping until the Forum rang like a market-sized shouting contest. The trick was not winning the argument, but surviving it without going hoarse. Legal proceedings formed the Forum's other soundtrack. Magistrates set up in shaded porticos, their lictors standing by with rods to maintain order, or at least wave menacingly at hecklers. Plaintiffs and defendants pled cases ranging from unpaid dowries to the suspicious disappearance of goats. Crowds lingered for juicy disputes, treating litigation as entertainment. Onlookers swapped theories, bets, and gossip, savoring a free show with the occasional moral lesson. No judge ever begged for silence. Noise was the forum's native tongue. Under the colonnades, gossip flowed like wine at Saturnalia. Matrons compared sandal prices while pretending not to notice gladiator posters plastered on nearby walls. Ambitious young men angled for advantageous introductions, loitering near senators like moths circling an oil lamp. Even the city's philosophers got in on the commotion. Stoics perched on steps declaiming about virtue. Skeptics muttered about fate, and Epicureans promoted the merits of lunch as the true path to happiness. Most pedestrians sidestepped the speeches with polite nods. A few heckled for sport. The sensory barrage was relentless. Sunlight bounced off polished marble, glinting off gilded statuary. Temple bells clanged sporadically, competing with the steady hum of bargaining. The smell was a heady cocktail of fresh bread, sizzling sausage, crushed herbs, and the unmistakable tang of mule traffic. Dogs wove between sandals, scavenging scraps. Pickpockets wove between distracted traders, scavenging purses. The forum did not discriminate. Everyone risked losing something, whether it was a coin or their patience. Amid this bustle, civic rituals unfolded with unruffled grandeur. Priests in laurel crowns paraded through with sacrificial animals, followed by attendants bearing incense. A chorus of boys rehearsed hymns under a basilica arch, their youthful voices valiantly competing with the fishmonger's latest discount announcement. Diplomats from far provinces arrived trailing translators, wide-eyed at the din, yet eager to blend into Rome's artery of commerce and policy. The forum might overwhelm, but it offered everyone a stage if they dared perform. Humor was as essential as a purse of coins. Satirists scribbled notes about toga malfunctions, overly earnest speeches, and moneylenders honoring Jupiter by charging heavenly interest. Jesters and street performers seized corners, balancing amphorae on their heads or juggling leather balls for a few coppers. Soldiers on leave loitered with swagger, loudly recalling exploits while polishing the dents in their helmets for effect. Even the city's pigeons joined the circus, dive-bombing dropped figs to applause or curses. For the ambitious, the forum was fertile ground. Deals were struck with handshakes firm enough to leave bruises. Political alliances brewed over hurried conversations beside a temple column, punctuated by nervous glances to ensure rival ears weren't lurking. Every gesture mattered: who clasped whose forearm, who offered which bench space, who subtly insulted whose sandals. If Rome had an invisible scoreboard, its digits ticked up here, fueled by human maneuvering and the occasional miracle of honest trade. As noon drew nearer, the chaos ebbed only slightly. Advocates postponed unfinished pleas, promising swift justice tomorrow. Merchants tallied earnings with quills scratching furiously. Philosophers sighed, muttering that wisdom was wasted on ears clogged with coin lust. Yet even as participants dispersed, the forum retained its hum like a drumbeat under Rome's breath. This square of flagstones had witnessed centuries of plotting, triumph, and rumor. Tomorrow it would do it again, unashamedly loud. By the time shadows began lengthening toward the basilicas, stomachs grumbled and minds pivoted toward lunch. The Senate might resume debate later, merchants might haggle anew, but for now Rome's center paused, not silenced, merely catching its breath before the next round of ambition. By noon, the 7 hills glistened like a griddle left too long on the coals, and even Rome's tireless ambition admitted defeat. The marble temples still gleamed, the basilicas still loomed, but the cobbled streets softened to a shimmering mirage of heat. Shopkeepers eyed the sun and decided no transaction was worth spontaneous combustion. Prudent Romans muttered the day's unofficial motto, "Nap if you can, because the sun wants you medium rare by noon." The first order of survival was prandium, the light midday snack, hardly a banquet, more a strategic truce between hunger and laziness. Households scavenged whatever was handy. Yesterday's bread rejuvenated with oil, a sliver of cold roast left over from last night's cena. If fortune smiled, or the eternally controversial salted fish paste known as garum. Romans adored garum the way children adore noise utterly, unapologetically, to the dismay of anyone with a sensitive nose. A few olives, a fig or two, and suddenly the blazing sun felt slightly less murderous. Street vendors transformed the overheated city into an impromptu picnic. Portable braziers hissed with skewered sausages, their fat spitting onto embers while hawkers promised the best boar this side of the Tiber. Boys darted through the crowds carrying baskets of chickpea fritters, shouting prices over the rumble of distant carts retreating to shaded courtyards. Garum-soaked tidbits found eager buyers, though one cynical poet swore you could follow the scent from the Aventine to the Alps. Between wafting smoke and ripe fish tang, the forum smelled like ambition's lunch break. Heat-drunk citizens sought mercy wherever shade dared gather. Porticos offered slim ribbons of respite, where merchants lounged, sandals kicked off pretending they weren't napping. Couriers sprawled beneath statues, their tablets abandoned to the gods until the thermometer had one existed relented. In tenement courtyards, children splashed each other with amphora water, squealing until scolded. Older Romans half-dozed against cool stone, heads nodding like pigeons roosting on the Capitol. The city, normally a brass band of voices, dropped to a hushed string section. Yet the pause was not absolute. For some, midday was prime time for gossip. Colonnades buzzed with murmurs of chariot races at the Circus Maximus. Which team's horses looked unbeatable? Which driver had offended Fortuna with too many boasts? Fans painted their loyalties on scraps of cloth, green or blue, debating strategy as if consulting military dispatches. Betting notes changed hands with theatrical secrecy. Although everyone within 3 paces could hear the wagers, entertainers capitalized on drowsy attention spans. A juggler stationed near the argulatum spun clay cups in lazy arcs, coaxing coins from half-asleep spectators. A flute player's languid melody slipped between columns, mingling with the occasional hawk cry overhead. Children chased mangy dogs with bread crusts, inventing games that ignored both heatstroke and hygiene. The entire tableau resembled Rome yawning, stretching, yet refusing to fully stop breathing. Domestic routines mirrored the streets, slaves tidied atriums in slow motion, fanning masters whose eyelids fluttered with the promise of nap nirvana. Curtains hung limp across windows, filtering the glare to an amber hush. Wealthier households retreated to triclinium couches, nibbling fruit while discussing nothing more urgent than whether grapes counted as an adequate vegetable serving. Philosophers argued that idleness sharpened the intellect. Skeptics countered that it merely dulled ambition. Neither side budged, possibly because both had succumbed to drowsiness halfway through the debate. For laborers bound to deadlines, the sun mocked from above, daring them to keep chiseling marble or hauling amphorae. Many chose discretion over valor, finding excuses to linger in shade until the worst rays passed. Builders paused mid-hammer swing, wiping sweat onto tunics already blotched with dust. Even soldiers on routine patrol slowed their pace, helmets glinting like portable ovens. Rome's midday inertia was a democratic equalizer. When soul blazed at full tilt, pride took a back seat to perspiration. Despite the languor, opportunity persisted. Savvy vendors targeted the half-conscious crowd with sweets, honey cakes, candied nuts, arguing that sugar cured heat malaise. A few thrill-seekers ventured toward temporary arenas for midday exhibitions, impromptu wrestling matches, exotic animal handlers parading bedraggled leopards for coin. Spectacle thrived even as the thermometer begged for mercy, and for every grumbler claiming Rome grows lazy, 10 others mumbled gratitude for an hour unclaimed by civic obligation. Gradually, shadows lengthened, and the pavement cooled enough for ambition to reawaken. Shop shutters groaned open, the hush cracked by the first hammer strike of a blacksmith testing his forge. Couriers rubbed eyes, girding themselves for another circuit of errands. The city exhaled, refreshed or at least resigned, ready to pivot from lethargy to industry. Rome's siesta wasn't indulgence. It was survival, cunningly wrapped in tradition. By the time the first real breeze teased the banners atop the basilicas, the forum stirred anew, lunch crumbs scattered, Wagers renewed, sandals tightened. Rome stretched her marble spine, declaring to the blazing heavens that she would endure another round. The siesta had ended, but the day's intrigue was only sharpening its claws. As the city shook off its midday stupor, Rome's attention pivoted to the one institution that could outshine politics, gossip, and household chores in a single sweep: the bathhouse. To modern ears, baths sound like hygiene. To Romans, they meant everything: networking, matchmaking, bragging, scheming, and occasionally remembering to scrub your elbows. If the forum was Rome's pulsing brain, the baths were its sprawling living room with better acoustics and hotter air. A proper bathhouse promised more than warm water. Patrons entered through a columned facade that signaled civic pride and often borderline architectural swagger. Inside, corridors led to a labyrinth of chambers, the apoditerium, where sandals and dignity were both casually abandoned, the tepidarium, a lukewarm limbo that coaxed the body into relaxation, the caldarium, a steamy cauldron designed to make your pores confess every sin, and the frigidarium, the chilly splash finale that either invigorated or permanently reset your spine. There was no official gossiparium, but considering the chatter bouncing off marble walls, the title practically engraved itself in the steam. The baths were democratic in theory, if not in scent. Entrance fees were negligible, subsidized by wealthy patrons eager for civic applause. Senators and stonemasons alike queued shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in modest towels or in what confidence they could muster. Social strata blurred beneath the sweat. Nobody cared about your lineage when you slipped on a wet tile like a startled peacock. Within these echoing halls, deals that shaped legacies might share the same bench as idle complaints about weather and goats. Conversations thrived in the mist. Merchants compared grain prices, politicians rehearsed speeches, and matrons plotted tomorrow's shopping raid with military precision. Someone inevitably raised gladiator gossip, which Murmillo looked indestructible, which Rotarius needed a holiday. Wagers passed hands with an innocent cough and a palm discreetly hiding coins. Steam swirled, secrets thickened, and a senator might emerge both exfoliated and mysteriously committed to a new trade alliance. Bathing wasn't merely dipping, it was choreography. Slaves hovered with strigils, curved metal scrapers ready to peel sweat and oil from limbs. Oils, perfumed with herbs, coated the skin until you resembled a particularly ambitious salad. Patrons glided between rooms, calibrating their comfort like connoisseurs. Some roasted themselves in the caldarium until red as amphora clay. Others braved the frigidarium plunge, gasping like startled carp, while onlookers offered applause or wagers on survival. Each transition felt ritualistic, a reminder that wellness in Rome involved equal parts suffering and socializing. Snacks punctuated the session. Vendors prowled the periphery, hawking honeyed almonds, spiced wine or figs for patrons unwilling to risk fainting mid-scrub. One wag claimed you could measure a man's fortune by the quality of fruit he munched in the tepidarium. Another insisted dignity drowned somewhere between the third almond and the second hour of sweating. Yet nobody left hungry, or more importantly, uninformed. A single lap through the pools delivered more rumors than a month of eavesdropping at the forum. Architecturally, bathhouses dazzled. Mosaics glittered underfoot, depicting dolphins, nymphs, or the occasional questionable mythological scene. Marble pillars reflected torchlight, making even steam look stately. Vaulted ceilings amplified laughter, debate, and the occasional unflattering grunt. Water sloshed with reassuring rhythm, reminding patrons that aqueducts, those improbable stone rivers in the sky, were Rome's proudest magic. The baths were civic proof that engineering genius and communal vanity could harmonize into something blissfully comfortable. Not everyone visited purely for relaxation. Ambitious youths loitered near prominent benches hoping to accidentally strike conversation with patrons of influence. Poets recited couplets to anyone too drowsy to flee, chasing sponsorship or at least sympathy coins. Lovers met eyes across steam clouds, weaving intrigue while pretending to adjust towels. Veterans boasted about campaigns, flexing scars as though the scars themselves deserved laurel wreaths. For every scrubbed back a favor was asked, promised or denied. Humor thrived as thick as vapor. Jokes about losing weight by sweating half your body into the drain mingled with exaggerated sighs over Lucius's bunion saga, retold daily, apparently immortal. Patrons teased newcomers about water temperature, invented tall tales about crocodiles in the frigidarium, and occasionally staged impromptu singing contests to see whose voice echoed longest. No philosopher could dismiss such revelry. Even the sternest stoic grudgingly admitted laughter worked better than austerity at dislodging grime. By late afternoon, the steady trickle of arrivals reversed. Patrons, scrubbed and scented, drifted into courtyards glowing under the descending sun. Sandaled feet tapped refreshed rhythms, conversations planned evening dinners, wages confirmed rendezvous at the Circus Maximus. Steam still curled lazily from vents, carrying the last whispers of gossip skyward, as if Rome's marble skyline exhaled secrets into the twilight. Clean, schemed, and faintly glistening, the city emerged lighter in step and heavier with fresh promises. The bathhouses had once again proven their civic worth, a place where bodies softened, alliances hardened, and Lucius's bunion earned another undeserved encore. When dusk draped its bronze light over the 7 hills, Rome's appetite woke like a lion that had been politely pretending to nap. Breakfast had been an afterthought, the midday prandium little more than a placeholder. Cena was where the real ambition lived. Supper was never just about eating. It was a declaration of status, a networking event, a stage for wit, and sometimes a quiet family ritual where a single steaming pot could hold a household together. In plebeian homes, Cena remained pragmatic. A clay bowl of spelt porridge or barley stew, thickened with whatever greens survived the morning market, anchored the table. Salted fish, a drizzle of garum, and maybe a wedge of goat cheese elevated the meal from survival to satisfaction. Wooden stools circled the table. Children fetched bread, while parents murmured about grain prices and distant cousins. Conversation stayed practical. What the landlord wanted, which neighbor borrowed the oil lamp again, whether the gods were hinting at rain or ruin. There was comfort in its ordinariness, the soft hum of domestic Rome winding down after a sun-baked day. But in the villas of the patriciate, Cena erupted into theatre. Slaves swept mosaicked floors, sprinkled saffron water to temper heat, and arranged couches in the familiar triclinium, 3 lounging benches set around a low table. Guests reclined sideways, propped on cushions, draping togas just so while feigning effortless grace. Table manners, ironically, were less about forks, non-existent, and more about not slipping onto the marble mid-anecdote. The evening's unspoken rule: no one truly eats until reputation is polished, alliances hinted, and compliments ladled like honey over fresh bread. The first gustatious appetizer might parade in olives glossed with herbs, oysters shipped absurd distances, or eggs seasoned with pepper so lavishly it made poets sneeze. Amphorae of Falernian wine, spiced, sometimes mulled, circulated early, lubricating conversation and occasionally loosening political restraint. Hosts wove subtle bragging into idle chatter. Oh, the figs? Barely ripened in Capua this morning. The slaves nearly wrestled the tree for you. Guests, fluent in such theatre, responded with practiced amazement, nibbling deliberately to avoid appearing famished. Main courses sought spectacle. Peacocks roasted until feathers shimmered like trophies. Wild boar studded with dates. Dormice stuffed with nuts and honey so decadent even satire couldn't exaggerate. For all its excess, plating mattered. Silver platters reflected flickering lamplight, transforming roast lamb into sculpture. Every dish signaled wealth through rarity. Fresh mullet from Baiae, pheasant from Gaul, asparagus weeks out of season. To be invited was to witness prosperity narrated in butter and smoke. Yet Cena was less gluttony than choreography of influence. Senators whispered deals over roasted kid. Poets debuted a sly epigram aimed at currying patronage. Ambitious equestrians subtly aligned themselves with powerful diners. Reputations balanced on laughter at the right joke, applause at the right lyric, or the generous offer to pour a neighbor's cup before it emptied. Misread the room, and you risked relegation to the conversational equivalent of a cold corner. Succeed, and your name slipped seamlessly into tomorrow's letters of recommendation. Storytelling filled the pauses between courses. Myths of Hercules, gossip about a governor's unfortunate haircut, even scandalous speculation about a Vestal Virgin's sigh during last week's procession. Anything to animate the air. Skilled raconteurs thrived, weaving humor with sly commentary, while quieter guests nodded sagely, practicing the art of appearing engaged without committing to an opinion that might outlive the evening. "The gods favor the discreet," one guest murmured, while eyeing a platter of honey cakes with anything but discretion. Wine deepened the mood. Diluted with water mostly, it encouraged joviality without immediate disaster, though by the fourth refill, philosophical debates about the nature of virtue might teeter towards slurred exclamations. Slaves glided silently, refilling cups, clearing platters, fetching perfumed towels to swipe grease from fingers. The triclinium smelled of cinnamon, roasted herbs, lamp oil, and ambition. Even the marble busts along the wall seemed to lean closer, unwilling to miss the next quip or confession. Humor threaded the entire ritual. Quips about not falling off the couch drew knowing chuckles as someone adjusted their recline. A guest too eager for figs might be teased about training for gladiator rations. The wry acknowledgement that tomorrow's headache would be worthy of a Senate decree did little to slow the pouring. Beneath the laughter pulsed the truth. Cena was less about fullness of belly than fullness of presence, proof that you belonged among those whose fortunes shaped the republic or empire, depending on which century's supper we're eavesdropping upon. When the final second base and mense dessert emerged, honeyed dates, soft cheese, candied nuts, the triclinium softened into satisfied hums. Deals sealed over roasted pork now felt inevitable. Rivalries blurred under cinnamon-sweet wine, and even satire dulled into friendly ribbing. Outside, Rome's alleys cooled, dogs dozed against doorways, and the city's heartbeat slowed, pulsing faintly beneath starlit tiles. Inside, crumbs marked triumphs of appetite. Laughter clung to the rafters, and couches bore the quiet imprint of a night's subtle maneuvering. Shena ended not with ceremony but with lingering. Guests rose carefully, togas rewrapped, promises half-whispered for tomorrow's favor or vote. The host, triumphant yet weary, surveyed the remnants, wine stains on linen, platters picked clean, echoes of tales and teasing still suspended in the lamp-lit air. Supper in Rome had done its duty. It fed, it impressed. It tangled lives a little tighter in the invisible web of obligation and delight. As the last embers of the Cena cooled, Rome did what it always did, refused to sleep like a reasonable town. Twilight didn't hush the city, it coaxed it into an entirely different register. Oil lamps flared against stuccored walls, amber halos pushing back the dark while the 7 hills shimmered like scattered constellations. From Aventine to Palatine, you could trace the night by its flickers, a million tiny stars tethered to clay and olive oil. Shadows lengthened, whispers sharpened, sandals scuffed cobblestones slick with evening mist, and the city began its encore. Street vendors, unwilling to surrender a single denarius, lingered by the markets with baskets of late figs and stubborn cabbage. Fresh, still crisp, they insisted, as if the produce hadn't endured 12 hours of sun and gossip. Bakers reheated coarse loaves, hoping to catch a hungry night walker on the way to dice tables. Smoke from tiny braziers rose in lazy ribbons, carrying the scent of chestnuts roasted for anyone with a coin and an appetite that ignored bedtime. Taverns, the unsupervised heartbeat of Roman nightlife, swung their doors wide. Inside, the air thickened with vinegar wine, fried snacks, and questionable morals. Dice clattered on scarred wooden tables, as patrons swore allegiance to Lady Luck until she inevitably betrayed them. Sailors hollered sea songs, legionaries on leave argued over whose swordsmanship was superior, and why it somehow required demonstrating on an empty amphora, and philosophers already tipsy debated whether fortuna favored the bold or merely the loud. The line between celebration and fistfight blurred to a whisper, but for most Romans this was simply the price of admission. Night brought danger as much as revelry. The city's vigils, Rome's rough equivalent of firefighters and watchmen, prowled with torches, sniffing for smoke and trouble alike. Fires were an ever-present threat in a city built of wood, straw roofs and optimism. Their shouted patrols echoed through alleys. Dormite securi, sleep safely they called, hoping reality would comply. Behind them, stray dogs barked at shadows, proving canine confidence in darkness was more myth than fact. Meanwhile, temples glowed softly, votive lamps shimmering in pools of quiet devotion. The faithful padded barefoot across cool marble, whispering prayers to Jupiter for fortune, Venus for love, Mercury for a merciful profit margin. Incense curled toward rafters, blending with the street's rougher scents of spilt wine and roasting chickpeas. Night festivals occasionally turned piety into pageant flutes, clashing cymbals, dancers weaving garlands of laurel while the gods looked on, presumably amused by the mortals' determination to honor divinity with half-rhythmic stomping. In wealthier quarters, private feasts spilled past their polite conclusions. Courtyards pulsed with laughter and lyre music, slaves ferried more wine than reason permitted, and poets attempted couplets too clever for sober tongues. Lanterns hung from beams like tame fireflies, casting bronze sheen over silk-clad diners who boasted of estates, gladiator victories, or a friend's cousin's rumored appointment to something prestigious. Here the night hummed with influence, its music composed of murmured promises and strategic compliments. Yet just a street away the tone shifted. Shady alleys birthed opportunity for thieves nimble enough to vanish before a shout could summon help. Cut purses learned to read the sway of a drunk senator's toga like a map to his coin purse. Not every stroll beneath the stars was romantic, unless you counted the romance of escaping unharmed. The unwritten rule: walk briskly, keep your eyes open, and if your sandals survive the night without mud, blood, or paw prints, thank Fortuna twice. Despite its perils, the night belonged to the dreamers. Lovers carved initials into fig trees by the Tiber. Poets rehearsed lines beneath balconies where perfumed silhouettes leaned dangerously close. And children too restless for sleep spied on revelers from lattice windows, memorizing the city's pulse. The smell of lamp oil, baking bread, and wet stone mingled into something unmistakably Roman, a scent equal parts grit and grandeur. Above, the stars mocked the clamor. Rome rarely looked up. Its attention clung to dice cups, whispered trades, or a suspicious rustle from a darkened doorway. Yet occasionally a pause, brief as a breath, allowed someone to notice Orion hunting across the sky, and for a heartbeat eternity seemed just as crowded as the Forum. Then another jug shattered, someone cursed Fortuna, and the cosmos sighed at being ignored once more. Humor thrived even in shadows. Your sandals pray you make it home intact, a wag muttered as two revelers stumbled past, arm in arm, neither entirely sure whose insula they were approaching. Cats, never asleep, threaded alleys like minor deities, eyeing discarded fish bones with imperial disdain. Somewhere, a drunk legionary serenaded a window, rhyming Caesar with easier to disastrous effect. Slowly the city's roar mellowed. Dice grew sluggish, last cups drained, lovers drifted indoors, and shutters thumped closed against the creeping chill. The vigils stamped embers in alleyways, muttering thanks to Vulcan for sparing the rooftops another night. Rome exhaled, its mosaic heart finally, reluctantly, slowing. Tomorrow's dawn would reset the cycle. Roosters, carts, gossip, ambition, but for now, the eternal city reclined beneath a quilt of stars and oil lamp glow, equal parts menace and magnificence, whispering to the Tiber as if confessing secrets too ancient for daylight.